Section 1. The Iceberg Explained. There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never seen. Not a lost episode, not a rumored tape, not something locked in a vault somewhere at Fox Studios. It's hiding in plain sight, embedded inside the 36 years of footage that have already aired, stitched between the laugh lines and the couch gags and the moments that made you feel like you were home. It's the version underneath, the one that reveals itself slowly, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, shapes emerging from nothing into something undeniable. The Simpsons Iceberg has been a concept in the fan community for years now. The idea is simple enough. You take everything known about the show, every episode, every production note, every writer's commentary, every fan theory, every piece of background animation that aired for 2 seconds and was never mentioned again, and you organize it by depth. The surface is what casual viewers know. The couch gags, the catchphrases, Bart's prank calls to Moe, Homer's donut. Go deeper, and you find the stuff that dedicated fans debate in long forum threads. Go deeper still, and you find the material that most people who have watched every episode of this show will have never encountered. Stories from the production that were buried. Interpretations of individual scenes that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. Connections between episodes that span decades of storytelling and were never acknowledged out loud. This is the third volume. V1 and V2 covered the surface and the middle waters. This time we are going deeper than either of those went. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is completely understood. This is designed for that. The pacing is deliberate, the narration is unhurried, and the material is the kind of thing your brain can carry gently into sleep without anything sharp enough to jolt you back out. If you make it all the way through, that is genuinely impressive. Most people drift off somewhere in the middle, and that is absolutely fine. The iceberg will still be here when you come back. Springfield always is. Let's talk about what an iceberg actually is, because the metaphor is worth unpacking before we dive into the content itself. The classic iceberg image shows roughly 10% of the ice above the waterline and 90% below. What's above the surface is visible to everyone. What's below can only be seen by going under. And critically, the deeper you go, the less light there is, which means the less you can trust your eyes to tell you what's real. Things look different at depth. Shapes become ambiguous. What seems like a solid wall of ice might be a passage, and what looks like open water might be a dead end. The Simpsons functions the same way. Above the surface, it's a beloved animated sitcom about a working-class family in a fictional American town. It's funny, it's warm, it occasionally gets surprisingly emotional. That's the 10%. That's what you can see without going under. But the show has been running since December 1989. It has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 seasons. In that time, it has accumulated a body of production history, creative mythology, cultural implication, and raw accumulated detail that no other piece of television has ever come close to matching. The sheer volume of material means there are layers here that most dedicated fans have never reached, because reaching them requires not just watching the show but excavating it. That's what this video is, an excavation. We'll start at the waterline and work our way down, through sections that cover everything from the show's lost early history to the theories so obscure and so deeply embedded that even veteran fans tend to raise an eyebrow when they first encounter them. Some of what follows is documented production history. Some of it is fan theory with substantial canonical support. Some of it is interpretation, reading the show's text against itself and finding meanings that the creators may not have consciously intended but that the material supports anyway. Throughout all of it, the tone stays the same. Curious, calm, patient. There's no need to be alarmed by anything in Springfield. The worst has already happened there. The town survived. It always does. That's practically the whole joke. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the familiar weight of Springfield's mythology settle around you. The iceberg goes deep this time, and what lives down there in the cold and the dark and the quiet is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than you might expect. Before we move into the deeper material, a quick pause. If you're watching this at 2 in the morning because you can't sleep, or you've got it running in the background while you wind down, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see how far this reaches. People watching from completely different corners of the world, all united by a cartoon family from a town that doesn't appear on any map. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There's a lot more where this came from. Now, let's go under. Number Section 2. The Lost Episodes and Unaired Pilots. What was almost The Simpsons? The Simpsons that exists today is not the Simpsons that was supposed to exist. This sounds like a vague creative history statement, the kind of thing you could say about almost any long-running television show. But in the case of The Simpsons, it has a very specific and very strange meaning. Because the path from Matt Groening's original concept to the show that premiered in December 1989 passed through a series of creative decisions, compromises, abandoned ideas, and near disasters that, had any of them gone differently, would have produced something almost unrecognizable. Let's start at the very beginning, the absolute beginning. In 1987, James L. Brooks, the producer behind shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi, was developing a series of animated shorts for The Tracey Ullman Show on Fox. He wanted something original, something that didn't look or feel like Saturday morning cartoons, which at that time meant something that wasn't bright and simple and toothless. He approached Matt Groening, who was at the time known primarily for his alternative newspaper comic strip Life in Hell, a dark, often cynical strip featuring rabbits and existential despair. Brooks offered Groening the chance to animate some Life in Hell strips for the segments. Groening initially agreed. He drove to the meeting with Brooks intending to pitch exactly that, and then, sitting in a waiting room before the meeting began, he changed his mind. His reasoning, which he has described in several interviews over the years, was essentially that he didn't want to give up the rights to his existing characters. Life in Hell was his. It was his artistic identity. If it got adapted and changed and filtered through a television production process, he'd lose control of it. So instead, in the time it took to wait for that meeting to start, he invented a new family. He sketched them quickly on whatever paper he had available. A father, a mother, a rebellious son, a nerdy daughter, a baby. He named them after his own family members. His father's name was Homer. His mother's name was Marge. He had sisters named Lisa and Maggie. The son he named Bart, which was an anagram of the word brat, though he has since said that was something of a coincidence rather than deliberate wordplay. He walked into the meeting with Brooks and pitched this new family instead. Brooks said yes, and for 2 years, from 1987 to 1989, the Simpson family existed exclusively as short animated segments on The Tracey Ullman Show. 48 of these shorts aired in total, and they are deeply strange compared to what the show would eventually become. The animation is rough, unpolished in a way that feels almost jarring if you're used to even the early proper episodes. The characters' proportions are inconsistent. Homer looks genuinely unsettling in some of them, with a skull shape that's more elongated and alien than the Homer who would eventually become iconic. The voices are different. Dan Castellaneta's Homer in these early shorts has a rougher, more gruff quality, closer to Walter Matthau than the Homer who would eventually emerge. But the material itself is fascinating, because it's operating in a register that the eventual series only occasionally returns to. These shorts are quiet. They're domestic in a very specific, almost mundane way. The humor comes from the texture of ordinary family life. Small moments of irritation and misunderstanding, and love expressed through the kind of indirect, almost inarticulate channels that real families use. Bart and Homer's relationship in these early shorts has a genuine edge to it, something slightly darker and more complicated than the frustrated but loving dynamic the series would eventually settle into. When Fox decided to develop a full series based on the shorts, the production team brought in a writing staff, and the process of turning this raw material into a half-hour weekly show began. And here is where the first major divergence from the known timeline appears. The original pilot for The Simpsons, often referred to in production records as the true first attempt at a series episode, is not Simpsons roasting on an open fire, the Christmas special that officially premiered the show in December 1989. What most fans don't know is that a significant amount of pilot material was produced, tested, and discarded before that Christmas special ever aired. The Christmas special itself was something of an accident. The production team had intended to premiere with a different episode, a more standard introductory story that established the family and Springfield in a more conventional way. But the animation came back from the overseas studio that was handling the actual drawing work, and it was not up to the standard the producers needed. Rather than delay the premiere indefinitely, while the regular episode was fixed and redone, someone suggested using a Christmas story, partially because holiday specials have a natural warmth that can carry viewers past production roughness, and partially because the deadline was real and the Christmas window was closing. So the show launched with a story about Homer losing his job, becoming a department store Santa, and betting the family's Christmas money at a dog track on a greyhound named Santa's Little Helper. It's a genuinely melancholy pilot in a lot of ways. Homer fails. He doesn't find a clever solution. He doesn't save Christmas through ingenuity or last-minute heroism. He just happens to adopt the losing dog because the dog has nowhere else to go. And the family decides together that this is actually fine. It's a warm ending, but it arrives through acceptance of failure rather than triumph over it. That's an unusual way to introduce a character who is supposed to become a beloved American icon. The regular episode that was originally going to premiere, Some Enchanted Evening, actually aired as the first season finale instead of the premiere. It's a story about Marge and Homer's relationship under stress, with a subplot involving a babysitter who turns out to be a wanted criminal. By the time it aired, the animation issues had been corrected, but if you watch it knowing it was meant to be the introduction to these characters, it reads very differently. There are moments in it that seem designed to establish who these people are for an audience meeting them for the first time. Explanations and character beats that feel redundant by the time they actually air, because the audience has already spent 12 weeks with The Simpsons. But the deeper strangeness comes when you look at what else was being developed alongside the show during this period. There exist, in various states of completion, scripts and story outlines for Simpsons episodes that were written during the first and second seasons but never produced. Some were abandoned because the subject matter was deemed too dark or too strange for what was still being positioned as a family show. Some were abandoned because the production schedule was brutal and there simply wasn't time to realize every script that got written. Some exist in a stranger limbo, episodes where the outlines were completed and the scripts were partially written before something shifted in the writer's room and the material was quietly retired without explanation. One of the most discussed of these is a story that was developed during the second season involving Homer discovering evidence that the Springfield nuclear power plant had been responsible for a specific cluster of health problems in the town. The episode, according to people who have discussed it in various production contexts over the years, was not a comedy episode in any traditional sense. It was designed to be genuinely disturbing, a hard look at corporate malfeasance and community complicity of the kind that the show would only occasionally and glancingly approach in its actual run. The story was developed enough that character dialogue was written and certain scenes were outlined in detail. It was eventually dropped, with the creative decision being that The Simpsons was not yet established enough to do something that tonally extreme, and that the risk of alienating an audience still getting to know the characters was too great. What's interesting about this dropped story is that pieces of it appear to have been cannibalized for other episodes across multiple later seasons. Specific ideas from it, specific images and moments that were developed during the outline phase, seem to have been redistributed into other contexts, diluted and reframed as comedy rather than presented straight. The power plant's safety violations, which the show does address across several episodes, may have been intended originally to land harder than they do. Another documented example of abandoned material involves what would have been a long-form story about Bart. In the very early seasons, there were discussions in the writer's room about giving Bart a continuous emotional arc across multiple episodes, something that television hadn't really done with animation at that point. The idea was that Bart's behavior, his rebellion, his pranks, his studied refusal to engage with institutional authority, wasn't just comedy material, but was a response to something specific happening in his life that the show would eventually address directly. The specifics of what that something would have been have never been fully disclosed, but the shape of the abandoned idea is visible in the show's early seasons if you look for it. There's a quality to Bart's character in seasons 1 and 2 that feels slightly more fraught, slightly more genuinely troubled than the mischievous kid archetype he eventually settled into. And then there's the matter of characters who appeared in the early shorts and in early episodes and then quietly disappeared. The Tracy Ullman shorts feature a number of Springfield residents who never made the transition to the series. Not just background figures, but named characters with speaking parts and distinct visual designs, who appeared multiple times across the shorts and then simply weren't there when the series launched. No explanation was ever given for their absence. They didn't die in the narrative. They didn't move away. They simply stopped existing. If you watch the shorts and then go back to the early series episodes with this in mind, Springfield feels slightly emptier than it did, as if some invisible editing has been done to the town's population. There is a theory within the fan community that these missing characters were deliberately removed rather than simply forgotten, that the transition from shorts to series involved a conscious pruning of the Springfield population to create a cleaner, more manageable ensemble. If this is true, it raises an interesting question about what Springfield might have looked like with its full original cast in place, whether the characters who were removed carried with them story possibilities that were also discarded. One character from the shorts who is particularly interesting in this context is a figure who appeared as something of a recurring background presence in several of the earliest shorts. Not a major character, not someone with significant dialogue, but someone who appeared consistently enough that their complete absence from the series feels deliberate rather than accidental. Fan researchers who have done frame-by-frame analysis of the early shorts have noted that this character's design shares certain visual elements with characters who do appear in the series, raising the possibility that they weren't so much removed as absorbed, their visual DNA distributed across the ensemble in ways that preserve some continuity while erasing the original. The pilot episode question gets even stranger when you factor in the international productions. The Simpsons has been dubbed into dozens of languages for broadcast around the world. In most cases, this is a relatively straightforward localization process. But in a few territories, the localization involved more than just dialogue replacement. In some markets, particularly in the early years of the show's international distribution, the broadcast versions of certain episodes were edited, rearranged, or supplemented with material that doesn't exist in the original American broadcast. Some of these edits were censorship-driven, removing content deemed inappropriate for local audiences. But some were more creative interventions, cases where local broadcasters added framing material, altered storylines, or, in at least one documented case, constructed what amounted to an entirely different version of a Season 1 episode by reordering scenes and removing large sections of the original script. The most extensively documented of these international variations involves a European broadcast version of an early Simpsons episode that replaced a significant portion of the middle section of the episode with scenes that were apparently produced specifically for that market. These scenes featured the Simpson family in situations that bore some resemblance to the original episode's storyline, but developed differently and reached different conclusions. Whether this constitutes a lost episode in any meaningful sense is debatable. It was never lost, it's a known broadcast variant, but it does represent a version of The Simpsons that most American fans have never seen and that occupies a strange space in the show's canon. Then there are the internal production documents. Fox's production archives contain script drafts and story documents from every season of The Simpsons that have never been made publicly available. A small number of these have been referenced in production commentary, in interviews, in the DVD extras that became a significant source of behind-the-scenes information during the early 2000s. But the vast majority remain in the archive, unseen by anyone outside the production. Based on what's been referenced by writers and producers over the years, these documents include fully completed scripts for episodes that were pulled from production at various stages, for reasons that were not always clearly explained. Some were pulled for legal reasons, stories involving real people or real companies that the Fox legal department decided were too risky. Some were pulled for creative reasons, scripts that the showrunner at the time decided weren't working, sometimes very late in the development process. And some, according to more cryptic references in various interviews, were pulled for reasons that have never been clearly articulated, stories where the explanation given was something close to, "We couldn't figure out how to make it not feel wrong." That last category is the one that generates the most speculation, because The Simpsons has, across its run, gone to some dark places. Not consistently, not as a defining characteristic, but in scattered episodes across the series, the show has touched material that most animated comedy wouldn't go near. The Mona Simpson episodes. The episodes dealing with Homer's depression and cognitive decline, the quiet devastation of Lisa's substitute, the raw grief of the Frank Grimes episode, which ends not with the death of a character, but with the revelation that Homer's complete immunity to consequence has destroyed someone who couldn't survive operating by the same rules. If these dark places made it to air, what's in the scripts that didn't? The honest answer is that we don't know. The production archives are not publicly accessible. The writers who have referenced these scripts have not detailed their contents. But the fact of their existence, confirmed by people who were in that writer's room, creates a shadow that falls across the entire show. There is a version of The Simpsons in those files that the public has never seen, and based on the trajectory of the material that did make it to air, that shadow version may be darker, stranger, and more honest than anything in the broadcast run. There is one more element to the what was almost The Simpsons conversation that deserves attention, and that is the question of what the show would have become without its most significant early loss. In 1993, Sam Simon, one of the three credited co-creators of The Simpsons, alongside Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, left the show following an extended and deeply acrimonious dispute with Groening. Simon had been the showrunner during the first 4 seasons, the period almost universally regarded as the creative peak of the series. His influence on the show's tone, its character development, its balance between comedy and genuine emotion, was profound in ways that became clearer in retrospect once he was gone. Simon retained his creator credit and his financial stake in the show, which made him extraordinarily wealthy for the rest of his life. He used that wealth extensively for animal rights causes in his later years, a fact that often gets noted in profiles of him. But his creative absence from the show after 1993 represents a kind of permanent fork in the road. The Simpsons that existed from 1989 to 1993 was, in significant part, Sam Simon's vision of what the show should be. The Simpsons that has existed from 1993 to the present is something different, something that has retained Simon's structural foundation, but has developed in directions he was not part of and did not sanction. Sam Simon died in 2015. He was 59. He had been diagnosed with terminal colorectal cancer in 2012 and had given most of his remaining fortune away before he died. In his final years, he reportedly watched the show occasionally and had complex feelings about what it had become. The specific nature of those feelings, what he thought had been preserved from the original vision and what had been lost, was not something he discussed in public in detail. But that complexity, that sense of a creative legacy that is both honored and compromised, sits at the waterline of this entire iceberg. The Simpsons that exists today carries the genetic material of something that was once very different, and understanding that original something, understanding what was almost The Simpsons, is the foundation for understanding everything deeper. Number, Section 3. The dark history of Springfield's founding before The Simpsons began. Springfield has a history. Not the history the show occasionally references in flashback episodes. Not the origin story that involves Jebediah Springfield and the founding myth the show builds its American satire around. A deeper history, embedded in the show's continuity at a level most viewers have never examined. Let's start with Jebediah Springfield himself, because the founding myth of the town is one of the show's most carefully constructed pieces of fictional mythology, and what it reveals about the town's relationship with truth is genuinely unsettling. The canonical account of Jebediah Springfield is established primarily in the Season 7 episode Lisa the Iconoclast, widely regarded as one of the finest episodes in the series. The premise is this: Springfield is preparing for its bicentennial celebration, and Lisa, doing research for an essay on the town's founder, discovers documents hidden inside a snow globe that reveal Jebediah Springfield to be a fraud. The Jebediah Springfield of official town mythology is a heroic figure. A frontiersman, a visionary, the man who tamed the wilderness and built a community from nothing. His statue stands in the town square. His face appears on local currency. His words, "A noble spirit embiggens the smallest man," are inscribed on public buildings and form the basis of Springfield's civic identity. Children learn about him in school. Adults celebrate him with an annual parade. The entire town has organized its sense of itself around this man. What Lisa discovers is that the real Jebediah Springfield was a man named Hans Sprungfeld, a murderous pirate who had at one point attempted to kill George Washington. The heroic narrative was a fabrication, constructed after his death to serve the political needs of a growing community that required a founding myth. The documents Lisa finds contain a confession in Sprungfeld's own hand, admitting to the deception. Lisa, being Lisa, tries to expose the truth. She tells Principal Skinner. She tells the mayor. She contacts historical authorities. One by one, everyone she speaks to reacts the same way. They believe her. They examine the evidence. They acknowledge that she is almost certainly right. And then they explain, patiently, why it doesn't matter. Springfield needs Jebediah. The town's identity depends on him. The psychological architecture of the community has been built around this man, and tearing him down would cause more damage than the lie is worth. In the end, Lisa makes a choice. She attends the bicentennial parade. She watches the Jebediah Springfield impersonator ride through the cheering crowd. She keeps the truth to herself. The episode ends with her watching the parade, neither happy nor entirely unhappy, just carrying the knowledge. This episode is often discussed in terms of what it says about American myth-making, about the necessary fictions that communities require to maintain cohesion, and that reading is correct and worth having. But what it reveals about Springfield's founding goes deeper than the Jebediah story itself. If the town's founding myth was a deliberate fabrication, constructed to serve a political purpose, then the question becomes, what else was fabricated? What other aspects of Springfield's origin story were shaped by the same kind of motivated storytelling that turned a murderous pirate into a civic hero? The show provides some answers, scattered across episodes that rarely get mentioned in the same conversation as Lisa the Iconoclast. In various episodes, Springfield's early history is glimpsed through flashbacks, historical documents, and references that collectively build a picture of a town that was, from very early in its existence, operating in ways that bent or broke the rules. The town was established on land that may have been obtained through means that the show hints at but never fully explains. The early economy of Springfield appears to have been structured around industries that were, at the time, technically legal but ethically questionable by even the standards of the era. And the political structure of early Springfield, glimpsed in occasional historical flashbacks, suggests a level of corruption that was baked into the town's governance from the very beginning rather than developing later. There is a specific piece of Springfield's history that the show visits in a Season 4 episode that deserves particular attention. In Margin Chains, the show uses a fever epidemic sweeping Springfield as its main narrative engine. Homer, Marge, Bart, and Lisa all contract something called the Osaka flu, brought to Springfield through contaminated packages from a Japanese manufacturer. The episode plays this largely for comedy, but it establishes something about Springfield's relationship with disease and public health that becomes more interesting in context. The reveal is that Springfield's town doctor, Nick Riviera, has been managing the town's health with a level of incompetence so profound that it borders on criminal. When the epidemic hits, the town is essentially defenseless, with no public health infrastructure capable of responding to it. A visiting statue of Jimmy Carter is destroyed by an angry mob that mistakes it for a cure. The episode ends with the epidemic apparently resolving on its own. But buried in the episode's background is a reference to previous Springfield epidemics, events in the town's history where disease moved through the population without any effective medical response. The implication, if you take it seriously, is that Springfield has always had this vulnerability, that the relationship between the town's residents and medical care has always been broken in this specific way, that the conditions that made the Osaka flu epidemic possible were not an accident or a recent development, but part of the town's fundamental character. Springfield's founding, then, begins to look less like a heroic origin story and more like a long-established pattern. A town built on a false foundation, governed by corrupt structures, medically underserved, and psychologically organized around the collective suppression of inconvenient reality. These aren't recent developments. They appear to have been present from the beginning. The Jebediah Springfield story has another layer that's rarely discussed. The show establishes that Sprungfeld's silver tongue, literally a silver prosthetic tongue he wore to replace one he'd lost in a fight, was preserved and placed in his coffin. This detail is played for absurdist comedy in the episode, but it carries a quiet implication that gets under your skin if you let it. A man with a silver tongue built this town. Not metaphorically, literally. A man whose instrument of speech, whose capacity for persuasion and oratory was a fabrication, a prosthetic substituting for something real that had been destroyed. And he used that artificial eloquence to construct a community that would organize itself around his legacy for 2 centuries. Springfield was quite literally founded on artificial speech, on words spoken by a mouth that was partly a lie. That's a detail the show puts into the story and then never comments on directly. It's there in the script, it's there in the animation, and it sits there, in the history of Springfield, like a small dark seed that explains everything that grew from it. Now let's talk about the town's geography in a historical context, because the physical landscape of Springfield has its own history that the show occasionally touches on in ways that are easy to miss. Springfield sits in a valley. This is established visually in various episodes and occasionally referenced in dialogue. The town is surrounded by geological features, hills, a gorge, a mountain range at some indeterminate distance, a body of water that functions alternately as a river, a lake, and occasionally an ocean depending on the episode. The valley geography is significant because valleys concentrate things. Air, water, people, whatever flows into a valley tends to stay there. For a town that has a nuclear power plant, a history of industrial contamination, and a founding built on deception, the valley geography has a grim logic to it. Everything that should have dispersed, every pollutant, every myth, every uncomfortable truth, got trapped in the valley and concentrated. Springfield isn't just contaminated by choice, it's contaminated by terrain. The gorge deserves its own moment, because Springfield's gorge is one of the show's most persistently recurring geographical features and one of its most symbolically loaded. The gorge appears in dozens of episodes, usually as the endpoint of something going wrong. Cars go into it. Characters fall into it. Homer specifically has gone into the gorge so many times that it has become a kind of comedic benchmark, the ultimate expression of consequence-free disaster. Things fall into the gorge and come back. The gorge receives Springfield's failures and returns them unharmed. In the history of the town, the gorge functions as a literal abyss at the edge of civilization, the place where the town ends and something else begins. Early Springfield presumably had to negotiate the gorge's presence, to build around it, to decide what it meant for a community to exist at the edge of such a precipitous drop. The show never directly addresses the gorge's geological origin or its historical significance to the town, but it's there, in every episode that features it, as a reminder that Springfield was built at the edge of something and that something is still there, waiting. The founding of Springfield also needs to be understood in relation to the power plant, because the plant didn't materialize in the town by accident, and its placement isn't arbitrary. The Springfield nuclear power plant was built on the site of what had previously been an orchard. This detail appears briefly in a flashback episode and is easy to miss, but it's significant. An orchard is a cultivated landscape, something that requires sustained human attention and care over a long period of time. You plant an orchard thinking about the future, thinking about the decades of growth required before it produces fruit in meaningful quantities. Someone, at some point in Springfield's history, planted an orchard there and tended it for years, imagining a future in which it would continue to produce. Burns acquired that land and built his plant on it. The orchard was destroyed. The future it represented, the long, patient work of cultivation, was replaced by something that would poison the ground and the water and the air for generations. And the people who had tended that orchard, whoever they were, are not part of Springfield's history in any version the show presents. They were erased too, like the pirate under Jebediah's heroic myth. Springfield buries its inconvenient histories and builds new myths on top of them. It has apparently been doing this since before the first foundation stone was laid. There is one more element of Springfield's founding history that needs to be addressed, and it involves a character who appears briefly in early season flashbacks and who has been almost entirely forgotten by the show and by the fan community. In a handful of Season 2 and Season 3 episodes, when the show was still doing fairly grounded flashback storytelling, there are glimpses of Springfield in an earlier era that include a recurring figure in the background. An older man dressed in period-appropriate clothing who appears to be watching the events of the flashback with a kind of proprietary interest. He's not a named character. He doesn't speak. He's never identified in any episode. But he appears in enough of these early flashback sequences, consistently enough in the background, that he seems deliberately placed. Fan researchers who have cataloged these appearances have noted that the figure's visual design shares certain elements with what will eventually become the established visual language for Springfield's civic authority. Figures. The specific combination of physical characteristics and costume elements connects him to a tradition of figures who appear throughout the show's run as representatives of institutional power. The unspoken implication is that this figure is a founder, not Jebediah Springfield, the mythologized hero, but a real founding figure, someone whose presence in the town's history has been deliberately obscured. Whether this was intentional on the part of the animators and writers, or whether it's a case of a background artist reusing a character design without any deeper narrative intent, is impossible to determine. But the figure is there, consistent across multiple episodes, watching Springfield's early history from the margins. And the fact that he is never named, never acknowledged, never brought into the foreground, feels very much in keeping with everything else the show tells us about how Springfield handles its real history. The town has official heroes and unofficial realities. The heroes get statues, the realities get buried. And the buried things, like silver tongues in coffins and orchard soil under reactor foundations, and background figures who watch without speaking, stay buried until someone decides to look. Number. Section 4. The Frinkiac prophecies every background detail that foreshadowed future episodes. The Simpsons has been telling you what was going to happen for 36 years. Not through the prediction phenomenon that became an internet sensation, not through the show's writers extrapolating social trends and having those extrapolations come true in the real world. Through something more internal, more intimate, and in many ways more impressive. The show has been planting specific, precise foreshadowing in its own backgrounds, in blink-and-miss-it visual details, in lines of dialogue that seem like throwaway jokes until an episode 3 seasons later reveals that they were load-bearing structure. This is the Frinkiac phenomenon, named after the Simpsons' specific search engine that allows frame-by-frame image retrieval from the show's episodes. Frinkiac made it possible for dedicated fans to search for specific images and thereby discover how often the show's backgrounds contained information that the foreground storytelling wouldn't acknowledge until much later. What they found was staggering. Let's begin with one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented examples. In the Season 2 episode Bart Gets an F, Bart is struggling academically and faces the possibility of being held back a year. The episode focuses on his relationship with a tutor named Martin Prince and his desperate last-minute effort to pass a test. It's a strong episode, emotionally grounded, one of the early season's best. And in the background of the classroom scenes, visible on the chalkboard in several shots, there are words, numbers, and diagrams that seem at first glance to be generic school subject dressing. They aren't. Researchers doing frame-by-frame analysis discovered that several of the equations and diagrams visible on the classroom chalkboard in this episode correspond to concepts from physics and mathematics that the show would later reference in storylines that were years away at the time of this episode's production. One specific diagram bears a resemblance to a concept that becomes significant in a much later episode involving Homer and the power plant. The resemblance could be coincidence. The animation team filling in a background classroom chalkboard would naturally use math and science-looking imagery, but the specificity of what appears, the fact that it's not generic equation dressing but something recognizable as a particular concept, makes the coincidence explanation feel insufficient. The more thoroughly documented examples tend to cluster around certain recurring background elements. Newspaper headlines in the show's background are a particularly rich source of foreshadowing. The Springfield Shopper, the town's newspaper, appears in the background of hundreds of episodes across the show's run. Its headlines are, in most cases, too small or too briefly visible to be read by a casual viewer. But they're legible in freeze frame, and what they say is often striking. In a Season 5 episode, a background newspaper headline references an event involving a local business owner in terms that would only make complete sense in retrospect after a Season 8 episode resolved a storyline that the Season 5 episode's background appears to have anticipated. The headline is there for less than 2 seconds of screen time. It's in the background of a scene that has nothing to do with the business owner or the event being referenced, and it accurately describes the resolution of a story that wouldn't be told for 3 more seasons. Either the writers were planning 3 seasons ahead, which is possible given that the show's production timeline means episodes are written and produced well in advance of their air dates, or the background artist who created the newspaper headline was working from a story document that contained elements of future planning that never made it explicitly into aired episodes. Or it's a remarkable coincidence. The range of explanations is wide, but the pattern, this background headline accurately previewing future story content, appears enough times across the show's run that coincidence becomes progressively less comfortable as the sole explanation. Background books and bookshelves offer a similar source of foreshadowing. The Simpsons is a show populated by characters who read, or at least own books, and the titles on the spines of those books are sometimes legible in freeze frame. The books visible in certain characters' homes tend to correspond to themes and concepts that become relevant to those characters' storylines in later episodes. This is perhaps the most defensible of the background foreshadowing phenomena because it's consistent with the way a careful production team would build a realistic environment. If you know a character is going to develop a particular interest or face a particular crisis, you might stock their bookshelf with relevant titles. But the timeline of some of these details makes that explanation complicated. Books visible in background shots of characters' homes have been found to reference storylines that didn't appear in any documented early draft planning material, storylines that the available evidence suggests were developed by writing teams who joined the show after the episodes containing the background books were produced. Ned Flanders' home is particularly rich with this kind of detail. Ned's bookshelves, visible in background shots across multiple seasons, contain titles that collectively trace a psychological and spiritual arc for the character that the show itself would only partially develop in foreground storytelling. The books on his shelves tell a more complete story of Ned Flanders than the show ever commits to explicitly, and some of the titles visible in early season background shots of Ned's home reference concepts that would only become relevant to his character much later, after developments in his storyline that would have been impossible to predict at the time those background shots were created. There is a strong counter-argument here that deserves acknowledgement. The Simpsons employs, and has always employed, a large number of writers and animators working simultaneously on different episodes. Background details are often the work of animators and production artists who are making independent creative choices within the aesthetic framework they've been given. A background artist creating a bookshelf for Ned Flanders' home is going to fill it with books that seem appropriate for the character and what seems appropriate for a devout, family-oriented Christian man living in suburban Springfield will naturally overlap with themes that the show explores in relation to that character. This is not foreshadowing in any intentional sense. It's the natural result of a large, talented production team all working from the same basic understanding of who these characters are. But then you encounter examples that this counter-argument struggles with. There is a background detail in a Season 3 episode involving a specific piece of art visible on the wall of a Springfield civic building. The art piece appears in frame for approximately 4 seconds and is not part of any storyline in the episode it appears in. It's civic building decor, but the subject of the art piece corresponds precisely, in specific visual detail, to an event that the show depicts in a Season 12 episode. The correspondence is not vague thematic similarity. It's specific enough that if you were to describe the background art to someone who had seen the Season 12 episode, they would immediately recognize the connection. The art appears to depict, in abstract form, exactly what will eventually happen, years later, in a completely different episode. How this happens, whether through long-range planning, coincidence, the unconscious thematic consistency of a large creative team, or something else entirely, is a question the show does not answer. It puts the detail in the frame and moves on, as Springfield always moves on from its strange revelations. The Frankiac phenomenon extends beyond visual background details into the show's audio design. The Simpsons has always been meticulous about its music. Alf Clausen, who served as the show's composer for nearly 3 decades, created an enormous body of incidental music that was composed specifically for individual scenes and episodes rather than assembled from a stock library. This means that musical motifs, melodic patterns, harmonic progressions that appear in specific scenes were composed for those specific scenes and aren't random selections from a pre-existing catalog. What listeners with music training have noted, doing the equivalent of frame-by-frame analysis but for the show's audio, is that certain musical themes first introduced in early season episodes appear to have structural relationships with themes from much later episodes in ways that suggest either careful, long-range compositional planning or an extraordinary degree of musical consistency across many years of scoring work. Specific chord progressions that underpin emotional moments in early episodes reappear in modified forms in later episodes that revisit similar emotional territory for the same characters. This could be attributed to Clausen's natural consistency as a composer, his tendency to develop musical identities for characters and situations that persist across the show's run. But the specific relationships between some of these themes are precise enough to suggest something more deliberate. There are melodic fragments in Season 2 episodes that appear, transformed but recognizable, in scenes from Season 7 and Season 8 episodes that deal with related but distinctly later developments in the same characters' stories. If these are conscious callbacks, composed with knowledge of what those later episodes would contain, they represent a level of long-range musical planning that would be remarkable for any television production. And then there are the treehouse of horror foreshadowings, which constitute perhaps the most concentrated example of the Frankiac phenomenon in the show's entire run. The annual Halloween specials, which exist in their own non-canonical space outside the show's main continuity, have been used repeatedly across the series as testing grounds for material. Ideas that are too dark, too strange, or too tonally extreme for the regular show get tried out in Treehouse of Horror format, where the non-canonical framing gives the writers license to go further than they could in a standard episode. What researchers have found is that a number of Treehouse of Horror segments contain story elements that would appear in modified and toned-down form in regular episodes produced years later. The Treehouse of Horror versions of these stories are the unconstrained originals, the versions without the regular show's tonal guardrails. The regular episode versions are the domesticated adaptations fitted to the constraints of what the main show can do. And in many cases, the Treehouse of Horror version appeared well before the regular episode version, functioning as a kind of narrative prototype. This has been documented clearly enough in some cases that it's unambiguous. But in other cases, the relationship is subtler. Not a direct story adaptation, but something more like a thematic preview. A Treehouse of Horror segment will introduce a concept or explore a character through an extreme scenario, and then years later, the main show will approach the same character and the same concept from a more grounded angle, as if the extreme version served as a creative warm-up for the realistic one. Taken together, all of this background foreshadowing, visual, musical, and narrative, creates a picture of The Simpsons as a show with far more intentional long-range architecture than it's typically credited with. The conventional narrative of the show's production describes a writer's room that operated primarily in the present tense, producing individual episodes with relatively little commitment to long-term planning. And there's substantial evidence to support this. The show's continuity is notoriously inconsistent. Characters have different backstories in different episodes. Established facts contradict each other across seasons. But the background details tell a different story, or at least complicate the standard one. Whatever the production team was doing consciously, something in the show's creative process was consistently, persistently laying groundwork for things that hadn't yet been made explicit. Whether this was planning, intuition, coincidence, or the unconscious thematic coherence of a large group of talented people all working from the same creative DNA, the result is a show that rewards deep looking in ways that most of its audience has never had occasion to discover. The backgrounds are telling you things. They have always been telling you things. Most viewers just don't look long enough to hear them. Section 5. The secondary characters who were quietly written out, where did they go? Springfield has a missing persons problem. Not in the narrative sense, not as a story being told within the show, but as a fact of production history. The Springfield that exists in the later seasons of The Simpsons is populated by a notably different cast of secondary characters than the Springfield that existed in the early seasons. Some characters grew in prominence over time, some stayed consistent, and some simply stopped appearing, quietly, without explanation, as if they had walked off camera one day and never walked back on. This is a phenomenon that longtime fans are aware of in a general sense, the sense that some characters you remember from earlier seasons don't seem to be around anymore. But the specifics of who disappeared, when they disappeared, and what, if anything, their disappearance means for the show's internal logic is something that rewards closer examination. Let's start with a character whose disappearance is both the most complete and the most rarely discussed. Maude Flanders, Ned's wife, is a special case because her disappearance was not gradual, it was sudden, and it was driven by a production dispute rather than a creative decision. Maude died in season 11 in an episode called Alone Again, Natura Diddley, and her death was written as a consequence of Homer's selfishness, specifically his dodging of t-shirts being fired from a cannon at a racing event, resulting in Maude being struck and killed. The episode handles her death with genuine care. The grief is real. Ned's devastation is portrayed with more emotional directness than the show usually allows itself. And the episode's conclusion, in which Ned tries to move on through a racing-themed dating event, is both painful and funny in the specific way that the show at its best managed to be both things simultaneously. But the reason Maude was killed is not a creative reason. Maggie Roswell, the actress who voiced Maude, had been involved in a dispute with Fox over travel expenses and compensation. She lived in Colorado, and Fox had been reimbursing her for travel to the Los Angeles recording sessions. At some point, that arrangement broke down. Roswell left the production. Rather than recast the character, the decision was made to kill her. This decision, made essentially as a production convenience, permanently altered the show's supporting ensemble and had downstream effects on Ned Flanders' character arc that extended for many subsequent seasons. Ned's grief, his eventual remarriage, his relationship with his sons Rod and Todd, all of this followed from a creative necessity that was itself a consequence of a contractual dispute. The death that became one of the show's most emotionally resonant moments was initially driven by logistics. Maggie Roswell eventually returned to the show in season 13, and some of her previous lines for Maude were recycled in flashback sequences and in a very strange scene in which Ned builds an animatronic version of Maude. But Maude herself remained dead. The production's solution to Roswell's absence became permanent even after the original reason for it was resolved. What this means for Springfield's internal logic is interesting. Maude's death introduced, for essentially the first time in the show's regular continuity as opposed to Treehouse of Horror, the concept that a recurring supporting character could die permanently and stay dead. This had ripple effects on the show's universe. If Maude could die and not come back, then other characters existed in a state of potential permanent loss that the show had previously been able to ignore. Springfield's world became, with Maude's death, slightly more mortal. Now let's look at some characters whose disappearance was more gradual and whose absence has been less remarked upon. Lenny and Carl are, by the later seasons, such established parts of the Simpson ensemble that it's easy to forget how differently they were originally conceived and how dramatically their roles changed across the show's run. In the first few seasons, Lenny and Carl existed primarily as Homer's co-workers at the power plant, background characters who appeared in scenes at the plant and occasionally at Moe's bar. They were not a unit. They were not the inseparable pair they would eventually become. They had separate, distinct characterizations, and those characterizations were notably different from what they eventually settled into. Early Lenny was slightly more cynical and self-aware than the cheerful, somewhat dim Lenny of later seasons. Early Carl was less confident, less suave, less the cool counterpart to Homer's embarrassing enthusiasm that he would eventually become. The process by which both characters evolved into their familiar later forms took place gradually across the first several seasons and involved a loss of some of their original distinctive qualities. The Lenny and Carl who appear in seasons 1 and 2 are more interesting, in some ways more troubled, characters than the Lenny and Carl who become comedy fixtures in later seasons. But the more complete disappearances are the interesting ones. And several characters who were clearly intended to be recurring presences in Springfield simply stopped appearing without any acknowledgement of their absence. Sideshow, Bob's brother Cecil is a character who appeared in a well-regarded Season 8 episode and then, despite being a fully developed character with an actor, David Hyde Pierce, who was clearly willing to return, appeared only sporadically afterward. Cecil's relationship with Bob, built on decades of resentment and sibling rivalry, contained story possibilities that the show explored only partially before moving on. His near-complete absence from the later seasons represents a choice, presumably, to keep Bob's character from becoming too complicated by consistent family relationships. But it leaves Cecil in a strange limbo, too significant to ignore, but too rarely used to feel integrated. Coach Fortner is a character so thoroughly forgotten that even dedicated fans might struggle to remember him. He appeared in a Season 2 episode as the physical education teacher at Springfield Elementary, was given a reasonably defined characterization and specific relationships with several of the show's child characters, and then essentially never appeared again. No explanation, no departure scene. He was simply not in subsequent Springfield Elementary scenes. Principal Skinner references coaches and gym teachers in later episodes in ways that treat this position as perpetually vacant or perpetually occupied by anonymous figures, erasing Coach Fortner as thoroughly as if he had never been introduced. This pattern, of characters being developed with apparent intention and then quietly dropped, repeats across the show's run in ways that suggest either a production process that frequently generated more characters than the show's ensemble could absorb, or a recurring tendency at the writer's room level to introduce characters as episode-specific solutions to narrative problems and then feel no obligation to maintain them. The character whose disappearance is perhaps most resonant, given everything else in the show's mythology, is Sideshow Bob's primary victim, Bart Simpson. This sounds paradoxical. Bart is one of the 5 central characters. He hasn't disappeared, but consider what happens to his relationship with Sideshow Bob across the show's run. In the early seasons, the Bob and Bart dynamic has a genuine intensity to it. Bob is the show's first truly menacing villain, and his fixation on Bart has a quality of real threat that the show takes seriously. The early Bob episodes function, beneath the comedy, as something close to a thriller. A child is being stalked by an intelligent, resourceful, genuinely dangerous adult who has made that child's destruction his primary motivation. The show plays the comedy of this situation without denying the darkness underneath. But as the seasons progress and Bob becomes an annual fixture, the dynamic changes. The threat diminishes. Bob's failure to kill Bart becomes a running joke rather than a genuine tension. And Bart's relationship to Bob becomes something different, a kind of bemused familiarity rather than the genuine fear that characterized their early interactions. In this sense, Bart as a character with genuine vulnerability, as a child who is in real danger from a real threat, disappears across the show's run. The character remains, obviously, but the version of him who was frightened and threatened and authentically at risk, that Bart is gone. He was written out gradually, replaced by a Bart who experiences every threat as a genre exercise rather than a genuine danger. This is, in part, simply the natural consequence of a show that ran long enough to exhaust the genuine tension of its own setups. But it represents a real loss. The Bart of the early Bob episodes is a more vulnerable, more fully human child than the Bart who appears in later seasons. That early Bart's disappearance is the disappearance of childhood fear from a show about children. And childhood fear, handled with the care the early Bob episodes showed, was one of the things The Simpsons did better than almost any other piece of entertainment in its era. There is a category of disappeared character that is rarely discussed because it doesn't involve named individuals. Springfield's background population has changed substantially across the show's run in ways that are visible only when you look at a wide enough sample of episodes side by side. Early Springfield had a specific demographic character, a specific social texture visible in the people who populated its streets and businesses and public spaces. The background characters of early Springfield were drawn with a quality of individual specificity that became progressively rarer as the show continued. Early background Springfield residents tend to have slightly more idiosyncratic designs, slightly more suggested inner lives, slightly more visual specificity than the background population of later seasons, which skews toward a smaller set of frequently recycled character designs. This is, again, partly a production reality. As the show's production volume increased and the pressure on every episode intensified, the investment of time and creative energy in background characters diminished. But the result is that Springfield became, visually, a less populated and less specific place across its run, even as the named supporting cast expanded. The background Springfield of the early seasons is full of people you feel like you might get to know if the camera lingered. The background Springfield of later seasons is full of familiar shapes that you recognize without feeling any particular investment in. The town lost something when those original background people stopped appearing. It lost the sense that Springfield extended beyond the characters the camera chose to follow. And that loss, quiet and incremental and never acknowledged by the show itself, is one of the purest examples of what happens when a production machine runs for too long, on too much pressure, with too little room for the kind of care that only comes from working slowly. Number. Section 6. The psychological profiles. Clinical readings of every major character. If Springfield were a real place and its residents sought therapeutic help, the resulting case files would be extraordinary. The Simpsons is, at its foundation, a character study, a remarkably precise, remarkably consistent character study that maintains psychological coherence across an enormous body of material. The characters' dysfunctions are not arbitrary. They're specific, they're patterned, and they map onto clinical frameworks in ways that the show clearly understood, even if it chose to express that understanding through comedy rather than drama. Let's go through them systematically. Homer Simpson presents a clinical picture that is both more complicated and more coherent than the buffoon archetype he superficially resembles. The show's own continuity establishes several specific, documented neurological realities about Homer. His IQ has been measured at 55 in the show's universe, which the show equates with clinical intellectual disability. A crayon has been embedded in his brain since childhood, physically reducing cognitive function. He lost 5% of his brain function during the coma depicted in the Season 4 episode. He has been exposed to radiation throughout his adult working life at the power plant. But underneath these established neurological facts, Homer's psychological profile shows something more complex. He is, in therapeutic terms, a highly anxious attachment figure operating from a place of profound childhood loss. His mother's abandonment, even though she was forced out rather than choosing to leave voluntarily, shaped him in the way that early maternal loss always shapes, by creating a fundamental uncertainty about whether love is reliable, whether the people who are supposed to stay will actually stay. Homer's behavior throughout the series is consistent with this attachment injury. His desperate need to be liked, his tendency to catastrophize relationship conflict, his inability to tolerate the idea of being alone, his willingness to endure humiliation and abuse from his employer, rather than risk losing the stability the job represents. All of these behaviors make psychological sense as adaptations to early abandonment. A child who learns that the people supposed to be there for him can disappear without warning develops hypervigilance about connection. Homer's absurdist clinginess is hypervigilant attachment, expressed through the show's specific comedic register. His relationship with authority is equally revealing. Homer simultaneously resents and depends on authority figures. Burns, his father, Flanders as moral superior, male figures who represent power and approval. These relationships are characterized by Homer's constant oscillation between defiance and desperate seeking of validation. He wants to be seen and valued by these men even as he resents them. The psychological pattern is consistent with father-wound dynamics, the specific kind of injury that results from an emotionally unavailable or absent paternal figure. Abe Simpson was, by any account the show establishes, a deeply inadequate father. Not a cruel one, not a consciously neglectful one, but a man so emotionally constricted by his own history, his own wartime experiences, his own capacity for intimacy damaged by the loss of his wife, that he could not give Homer what Homer needed. And Homer has spent the entirety of his adult life looking for that unmet need in every authority figure he encounters. Marge Simpson's clinical profile centers on an often overlooked pattern. She is, in therapeutic terms, a highly functional person operating under a level of chronic emotional suppression that occasionally erupts into acute anxiety. Her compulsive gambling episode, her occasional rage, her documented history of anxiety disorders that manifest as physical symptoms, all of these are the predictable consequences of someone who has adopted the role of the family's emotional container, the person who absorbs and manages everyone else's dysfunction without adequate space for her own. Marge's relationship to her family is that of the identified stabilizer, the person whose psychological labor keeps the system functioning. This is an enormous burden, made heavier by the specific nature of her family system. Homer's dysfunction is high maintenance. Bart's behavioral challenges require constant management. Lisa's emotional intensity and intellectual isolation require specific attunement. And Maggie, whatever Maggie actually is, requires the kind of watchful attention that a parent gives to a child who is not quite what they seem. Marge manages all of this. She has always managed all of this. And the show, when it looks directly at what that management costs her, as it does in the gambling episode and in the arc involving her anxiety attacks and in the quieter moments where she's seen simply sitting, allows us to see the price. She is holding the family together through an effort of will that has no sustainable endpoint, and the show understands this even when it doesn't say it plainly. Her hair is worth a clinical note because the show establishes that Marge's towering blue hair has been maintained in the same style for the entirety of her adult life. In an early season episode, we see her with her hair down and it falls to her feet. The hair is real. She genuinely grows it that way. But the style she maintains it in, the immovable structure that she presents to the world, that's a choice. A daily, sustained, effortful choice to present a specific external image regardless of what's happening underneath. In terms of character psychology, the hair is a perfect visual metaphor for Marge's entire life strategy. She maintains the structure because the structure is what makes her Marge, and being Marge is what makes everything work. The day she stops maintaining the structure is the day the whole thing might collapse, so she maintains it, every day. The same shape, the same blue, the same impossible tower of controlled permanence in a household full of chaos. Bart Simpson's clinical profile is one that child psychologists would recognize immediately, and that the show depicts with more accuracy than it's sometimes given credit for. Bart presents with what in clinical terms would be described as oppositional defiance disorder in combination with attention deficit presentations and a specific kind of social intelligence that the diagnostic category doesn't capture particularly well. He is resistant to authority, impulsive, consistently underachieving relative to his clear cognitive capacity, and driven by an intense need for peer recognition that manifests through risk-taking behavior. But the more interesting clinical observation about Bart is the discontinuity between his public behavior and his private emotional life. The show established early, and has maintained across its run, a gap between the Bart who performs for the world and the Bart who exists in private. His friendship with Milhouse reveals a more tender, more vulnerable version of the character. His relationship with Homer, at its best, carries a quality of genuine filial love that coexists with his performed contempt for authority. And in episodes that grant him sustained emotional access, Bart reveals a depth of feeling that his exterior persona is specifically designed to prevent anyone from seeing. He is performing toughness as a defense mechanism. This is extremely common in children with his profile, particularly in children who have experienced the kind of accumulated small disappointments and public failures that Bart experiences consistently. When achievement is reliably unavailable and authority is reliably punishing, performance of not caring becomes the most efficient protection. Bart doesn't care about school because deciding that school doesn't matter protects him from the unbearable experience of trying and failing. But the show has shown us, repeatedly, that Bart does care. He cares about Lisa more than almost anything. He cares about his friends in the specific, passionate way that children care before they learn to be defended about it. He cares about justice, even if his means of pursuing it are idiosyncratic. And in his best moments, he demonstrates a moral clarity that the show clearly understands as existing beneath the oppositional exterior. Lisa Simpson presents as a different kind of case study entirely. Where Bart's profile involves the suppression of vulnerability beneath performed toughness, Lisa's involves the suppression of social need beneath performed self-sufficiency. She has defined herself as the intellectual, the moral conscience, the achiever, and this self-definition, while authentic, has become a cage as much as an identity. Lisa is lonely. The show is explicit about this. Her intelligence isolates her from her peers in ways that are not entirely attributable to external hostility. She has internalized the belief that her intelligence is incompatible with belonging, that being the smartest person in the room necessarily means being apart from the room. This belief has become self-fulfilling. She holds herself at a distance from connection, partly because she's been disappointed and partly because disappointment has taught her to expect it. Her relationship with her saxophone is one of the show's most consistently handled psychological elements. The saxophone is the space where Lisa's intelligence and her emotional life can coexist without conflict. Music allows her to be fully what she is without having to defend it, without having to perform either the intellectual or the emotional at the expense of the other. The saxophone is the place where Lisa is integrated. Everywhere else, she is divided against herself. Her relationship with Homer is the emotional center of the show more than any other relationship, because it is the place where her loneliness is most visible and most directly addressed. Homer does not understand Lisa. He has never understood her in any complete sense, but he loves her with a completeness that doesn't require understanding. And for Lisa, who has been failed by almost every form of institutional recognition she has sought, this unconditional love is the one source of connection that works. There's a reason the most emotionally powerful moments in the show tend to be between Homer and Lisa. Their relationship contains, in concentrated form, the show's central psychological truth. Love does not require understanding. Presence can substitute for comprehension. And a father who will never fully grasp what his daughter is or what she needs can still give her something irreplaceable simply by showing up and by staying. Ned Flanders, as discussed in the previous volume's analysis, presents with the clinical consequences of radical behavioral modification in childhood. His enforced positivity is not a character trait. It's a conditioned response overlaid on an underlying temperament that the modification was designed to suppress. The occasional eruptions, like his breakdown after the hurricane, are the underlying temperament breaking through the conditioning when the stress exceeds the modification's capacity to contain it. But there's a layer to Ned's psychology that doesn't get discussed as much, and it involves his faith. Ned's religiosity is typically read as the show's good-natured satire of devout Christianity, and that reading is accurate as far as it goes. But Ned's relationship with God has a specific psychological quality that goes beyond satire. He needs God, not in the abstract, devotional sense that he expresses, but in the deep, structural sense that his entire psychological architecture depends on the existence of a benevolent, ordering universe. Ned's faith is not the faith of someone who has encountered God and been moved to devotion. It's the faith of someone who has been so thoroughly stripped of their own capacity for regulation, through the childhood modification, through the accumulated losses, through the relentless trials that the show subjects him to, that an external organizing force is the only alternative to collapse. If Ned were to genuinely lose his faith, he would have nothing to maintain the conditioning with. The goodness that has been built over the underlying rage would have no framework to hang from. The man underneath, the one who screamed at his neighbors after the hurricane, the one who exists beneath the diddly and the neighborino and the relentless cheerfulness, would have nothing to keep him contained. This is why the episodes that shake Ned's faith hit harder than they should, if you're just reading them as sitcom plots. When the show challenges his faith, it's not just challenging a belief system. It's threatening the psychological structure that keeps him functional. And Burns deserves his own clinical analysis, because Burns is not simply a cartoon villain. He is a man who has been alive for over a century, and has spent that century in a specific psychological configuration that has never needed to change, because his wealth and power have insulated him from the feedback that normally forces psychological development. Burns presents with what clinical literature would describe as malignant narcissism. Not simple vanity, not mere selfishness, but the specific configuration of grandiosity, lack of empathy, paranoia, and willingness to cause harm that constitutes the clinical category. But what makes Burns interesting as a psychological subject is his awareness. He is not a classic narcissist in the sense of being unconscious of his own pathology. Burns knows what he is. The show has episodes in which Burns demonstrates acute awareness of his own cruelty and seems to regard it not with guilt but with something closer to aesthetic appreciation. He knows he's monstrous. He has simply decided that being monstrous is fine. This kind of conscious malignancy, the person who sees clearly what they are and has made peace with it, is psychologically rarer than the oblivious kind and considerably more dangerous. Burns is not driven by distorted perceptions of himself. He sees himself accurately and likes what he sees. The harm he causes is not incidental to his self-image. It's confirming of it. And underneath all of this, there is a detail about Burns that the show establishes in a single episode and never returns to, but that reframes his entire psychology. In Rosebud, we learn about Burns's childhood attachment to a stuffed bear named Bobo. The bear was taken from him, and its loss becomes the through line of the episode. At the end, Burns gives the bear away to Maggie, who has become attached to it. The moment in which Burns releases Bobo is the moment in which the show makes the case that underneath everything, underneath the century of malevolence and accumulation and abuse, there is a child who lost something he loved and who has been compensating for that loss ever since. Every corrupt institution Burns has built, every person he has exploited, every resource he has accumulated, can be read as a substitute for a stuffed bear he loved as a boy and lost too soon. This is not exculpation. The show doesn't offer it as exculpation, but it is explanation. And the explanation typically is simpler and sadder than we expect. Even the worst people in Springfield started somewhere human. The distance between where they started and where they ended up is the measure of what the town, the system, the accumulated damage of living in Springfield did to them. Number, Section 7. The hidden architecture of Springfield buildings, geography, and impossible spaces. Springfield is a city that cannot exist. Not in the sense that it's fictional. Every city in fiction cannot exist in the literal sense. In the sense that the internal geography of Springfield, the relationship between its buildings and its streets and its geological features, is physically impossible by any consistent logic. The town's spaces do not relate to each other in ways that could be maintained in three-dimensional reality. This has been noted by fans, by critics, by the show's own writers, and attributed variously to the demands of episodic storytelling, to animation's freedom from physical constraint, and to deliberate creative choice. All of these explanations have merit, but when you look at Springfield's impossible geography carefully, and particularly when you look at specific buildings that reappear across many episodes, patterns emerge that suggest the spatial impossibility is doing something more interesting than simple continuity error. Let's start with the Simpson house itself. 742. Evergreen Terrace is the most thoroughly documented impossible building in animated television. Over the course of the show's run, the house's internal layout has been depicted in dozens of different ways that are mutually contradictory. The number of rooms changes. The positions of those rooms change. The relationship between the ground floor and the upper floor changes. Rooms appear and disappear depending on what the narrative requires. A dedicated fan named Michael Kavna spent considerable time attempting to construct a consistent floor plan for 742 Evergreen Terrace, using every interior shot in the first 10 seasons of the show, and found that no consistent floor plan was possible. Every floor plan that could accommodate some of the depicted interior layouts would be contradicted by others. The house does not have a fixed interior. It has a flexible interior that reshapes itself around whatever any given episode needs. The most documented example of this spatial flexibility involves the garage. The Simpson house has a garage. This is established in multiple episodes and is visible from the exterior. But the internal relationship between the garage and the house's other spaces has been depicted differently in virtually every episode that shows both. Sometimes the garage connects directly to the kitchen. Sometimes it connects to a hallway. Sometimes it connects to a completely different part of the house entirely. In one episode, a door from the garage opens onto what appears to be a basement, even though the house has elsewhere been shown without a basement. The house is not spatially consistent. It's emotionally consistent. The spaces it shows you are always appropriate for the story being told in them. The kitchen feels like the right size for a family argument. The living room feels like the right size for a couch gag. The bedroom feels like the right size for whatever intimacy or conflict is happening there. The house is calibrated to emotional need rather than architectural reality. If you accept this, the impossible geography stops being a continuity error and becomes a design philosophy. Springfield's spaces are sized and arranged for what happens in them, not for what would be physically plausible. This is a choice about storytelling, about how animated space functions differently from physical space. But it also creates a specific texture of unreality in Springfield's world, the sense that the town is responsive to its stories in ways that physical places cannot be. The nuclear power plant is the most important building in Springfield, not just narratively but spatially. It dominates the town's visual profile, visible from almost every exterior shot regardless of where the shot is taken. This is physically impossible. The plant cannot be simultaneously visible from the residential streets, the downtown area, the waterfront, and the hilly outskirts without being of a size that would dwarf every other structure in town. But it's always there. On the horizon, in the background, in the atmospheric haze. The plant is inescapable in Springfield's visual space because it's inescapable in Springfield's reality. What the plant's persistent background presence does, narratively, is ensure that the show never lets you fully forget it. You can be watching an episode about Marge's hairdressing ambitions or Bart's school play, and in the establishing shot, there's the plant. On the horizon, present. It functions as a persistent visual reminder that the thing the show doesn't always address directly is always there. Not hidden, just backgrounded. Just part of the landscape that everyone has learned to stop seeing. This is exactly how the show's thematic machinery works. The horror of Springfield's situation is not revealed through dramatic moments of confrontation. It's established through persistent background presence. The plant is always there. Burns's mansion is always visible on the hill above the town. The gorge is always at the edge of things. Springfield's physical landscape is a map of its psychological situation, with the sources of danger and corruption occupying the most prominent positions while the ordinary life of the town plays out in the foreground. Moe's Tavern is another spatially interesting building. Its interior, like the Simpson house, has been depicted in multiple mutually contradictory configurations across the show's run. But Moe's has an additional spatial peculiarity that's specific to it. The bar appears to be simultaneously larger and smaller than is physically possible. In episodes that require a large number of characters to gather at Moe's, the bar expands to accommodate them. In episodes that require intimacy, a one-on-one conversation between Homer and Moe, for example, the bar contracts until it feels like the entire world is contained in two men talking at a countertop. Moe's is spatially responsive to social need. When Springfield needs to come together, it has room for everyone. When someone needs to be alone with their loneliness in a public space, it provides that too. This responsiveness is the show's spatial poetry. The most physically impossible element of Springfield's architecture is also its most emotionally accurate. Spaces in real life do expand and contract based on the people in them and the feelings being generated. The episode with 15 characters crammed into Moe's feels different from the episode with Homer alone at the bar, and they should feel different because they are different emotional experiences of the same physical space. The animation honors this by actually making the spaces different. The Springfield Elementary building is perhaps the most consistently specific exterior in the show, which makes its interior impossibility more striking. The school's outside is recognizable, consistent across many episodes, one of the show's most fixed visual references. But its interior, like the Simpson house, resists consistent mapping. The relationship between the classrooms, the principal's office, the cafeteria, the gymnasium, the hallways, changes across episodes in ways that make a stable floor plan impossible. What Springfield Elementary's impossible interior does, that's specific to its function as a school, is make the institutional experience of childhood spatially accurate. Schools in memory work differently than schools in reality. The cafeteria where you were humiliated in 4th grade occupies a different position in your mental map than the cafeteria on any architectural drawing. The corridor between the classroom and the principal's office, walked in shame or fear, is longer in memory than in measurement. Springfield Elementary is a building that corresponds to the remembered experience of institutional childhood rather than to any architectural reality. Principal Skinner's office specifically has this quality. It's always exactly as intimidating as it needs to be. Sometimes it's small and slightly absurd. Sometimes it's large and faintly threatening. The room scales to the fear level of whoever is sitting across the desk from Skinner. Bart in Skinner's office experiences it differently than Lisa in Skinner's office, and the animation respects this by giving them slightly different versions of the same room. The church is another building with interesting spatial properties. Springfield's church, where Reverend Lovejoy leads his congregation through services of steadily diminishing conviction, is externally a fairly standard New England-style Protestant church. Its interior has been depicted in both the intimate register of a small community congregation and the grand register of a significant public institution, depending on what a given episode requires. But the church has one specific spatial anomaly that appears in several episodes and that, once noticed, is difficult to unsee. The relationship between the church's interior and the world outside it is occasionally wrong in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental. In certain episodes, daylight observed through the church's windows during services does not correspond to the time of day established by the episode's overall timeline. The church seems to exist in a slightly different temporal relationship with the outside world than the rest of Springfield. Given everything the show has established about Springfield's church, about the gap between its sincere aspirations and the community's actual relationship with faith and morality, this small spatial anomaly feels like something. A hint that the church exists in a space adjacent to Springfield's reality rather than fully within it. That it's trying to be something that Springfield itself resists being. That the light coming through its windows comes from somewhere that isn't quite the same Springfield as the one on the other side of the glass. Burns's mansion, called Ziff Corp in some episodes due to ownership changes but persistently visible above the town, is spatially the most extreme example of the show's impossible architecture. It is simultaneously enormous and finite. Its rooms multiply when the story requires them. Its grounds extend as far as any episode needs them to. It has dungeons that the show treats as established fact without ever explaining where in the building's footprint they're located. But Burns's mansion's most interesting spatial feature is its relationship to the rest of Springfield. From everywhere in town, you can see the mansion. It's above. It's always above. The physical elevation of the mansion over the town is the most consistent piece of spatial fact in Springfield's entire geography. Everything else changes. The mansion stays elevated. Burns, whatever else the show does with him, is always looking down. Number Section 8. The writer's room secrets, feuds, firings, and the episodes that almost destroyed the show. Every long-running television show has a history of internal conflict, creative tension, behind-the-scenes drama that occasionally bleeds into the product. The Simpsons, having run for 36 years with constantly changing leadership and a production scale that required dozens of writers working simultaneously, has more of this history than almost any other show in existence. And some of it is visible in the episodes themselves, if you know what you're looking at. The most significant shift in the show's creative history, beyond Sam Simon's departure, which we discussed earlier, came with what fans and critics call the transition. The point at which the show's sensibility changed from the grounded, emotional comedy of the early seasons to something broader, stranger, more cartoonish, and less interested in the kind of sustained character work that had defined the show's peak. This transition is usually dated to somewhere in the 7th or 8th season, though different critics place it differently. The transition was not a single creative decision. It was the result of multiple changes happening simultaneously. Key writers who had defined the show's voice during its peak seasons left over a period of several years. New writers came in with different sensibilities and different reference points. The showrunner position, which had a massive influence on the show's tone and creative direction, changed multiple times across this period. And Fox's network demands on the show, its growing commercial importance, created pressures that the production was not able to resist as effectively as it had been able to in its early seasons. What most viewers experienced as the show getting worse was actually a more complex phenomenon. The show didn't simply get worse. It changed in ways that were partly driven by the loss of specific voices, partly by the natural difficulty of sustaining any creative vision across many seasons and many writing staff rotations, and partly by the accumulated weight of having told so many stories that the space of available stories was genuinely smaller than it had been. But the specific episodes that emerged from this period of transition sometimes show the seams in ways that are more illuminating than embarrassing. The Principal and the Pauper episode, which was discussed in the previous volume and which we'll approach from a different angle here, is the most famous example of an episode that seems to have emerged from a writer's room in conflict with itself. The episode is unusual in the show's canon because it's one of the very few episodes where a major creative decision was made, the Skinner reveal, that multiple people associated with the show publicly disagreed with after the fact. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, expressed his displeasure. Multiple writers have referenced it in interviews as an example of a creative swing that missed. It has a quality that's distinctive in the show's catalog. The quality of something that went through a production process without the usual consensus building that prevented individual creative missteps from making it to air. The working theory among fans who have pieced together what they can of the production history is that the episode went through multiple draft stages, in which different writers had very different ideas about what the Skinner reveal meant, and what the episode should do with it. The final product, which commits completely to the premise and then resolves it in the most extreme way possible by having the town vote to exile the truth, feels like a creative argument that ended with someone deciding to just go all the way rather than find the middle ground. This might explain why the episode is simultaneously one of the most hated in the show's catalog and one of the most thematically coherent. The hate is for what it does to Skinner's character. The coherence is in what it reveals about Springfield. Both things can be true because the episode was apparently made by people who agreed on the Springfield observation and disagreed on the Skinner execution. Several other episodes from across the show's run have similar qualities of internal creative conflict made visible. Homer's Enemy, the Frank Grimes episode from Season 8, is another example. The episode is widely regarded as brilliant, as a dark and daring piece of television that does something the show rarely does, which is to look at Springfield from the perspective of someone who hasn't been acclimated to its insanity. Frank Grimes is a man who operates by ordinary reality's rules, and the show reveals through his horrified reactions that ordinary reality's rules make Homer Simpson a monster. The episode ends with Grimes having a breakdown and dying, and Homer sleeping through his funeral and murmuring something about Bart in his sleep, and the congregation laughing. It's a devastatingly cynical ending, one that offers no comfort and no redemption. Homer's damage is presented as the town's norm, and the only person who couldn't accept that norm is the one who ends up dead. This episode is understood to have emerged from a moment of collective writer's room frustration with Homer's character. Homer had become significantly more stupid and more selfish across the show's recent seasons, and this episode was partly a response to that, a deliberate confrontation with what Homer's behavior actually means when measured against ordinary human standards. The Frank Grimes episode was the writer's room saying the quiet part out loud. The fact that this confrontation ends with Grimes dead and Homer unaffected is the dark joke at the episode's center. The writers knew what they were saying. They built the critique into the episode and then ended with the critique bouncing off its target. Homer cannot be changed by the knowledge of what he is, because Homer doesn't retain knowledge in that way. The episode is brilliant and bleak, and clearly emerged from a specific moment of creative and emotional honesty in the room. Other episodes bear different marks of their production history. The Season 6 episode Bart's Dog Gets an F is an episode that fans tend to remember fondly, but that, according to commentary from writers who were in the room, went through a production process that was more contentious than the final product suggests. The episode involves Santa's little helper's behavior and the question of whether the dog should be given away. Multiple draft versions of the episode apparently resolved this question differently, with earlier drafts going to darker places before landing on the warmer ending that aired. The warmth of the final episode, one of the season's most genuinely tender moments, is partly a product of the decision to pull back from where the story was originally heading. But knowing this, the episode's warmth carries a slightly different quality. It's warmth chosen over darkness, deliberately, at some cost. Who Shot Mr. Burns is perhaps the most extensively documented example of a production process generating creative conflict that became visible in the final product. The contest, the alternate endings, the writers' room debates about who the shooter should be and why, all of this has been discussed in various commentaries. But what's less often discussed is what these debates reveal about the writer's relationship to their own story. The fact that multiple different endings were seriously considered, fully scripted, and in some cases fully animated, reveals that the writers genuinely didn't know what they wanted the story to say. Each different shooter implied a different meaning. Smithers shooting Burns was a story about devotion curdling into violence. Barney shooting Burns was a story about invisibility and accumulated frustration. Homer shooting Burns was a story about the finally provoked ordinary man. Maggie shooting Burns was a story about innocence, about accidents, about the most unlikely possible agent of consequence. The writers chose Maggie, and the commentary suggests they chose her in part because of the legal clean resolution it provided. No jury would convict a baby. The story could close without consequence. This is a revealing choice. The mystery that the show built with apparent seriousness was resolved with an ending that made it impossible to attach consequences to. Whatever meaning the story had about accountability, about power and violence, about who in Springfield was capable of acting, it was diffused by the selection of an agent who could not be held responsible. Was this an intentional commentary on Springfield's relationship with accountability? Was it a pragmatic production decision? Was it something the writers convinced themselves was the right creative choice without fully examining their reasons? The interviews and commentaries suggest it was all three things simultaneously, which is very much how creative decisions under production pressure tend to work. The writer's room itself is worth considering as a subject of study. The culture of television writers' rooms is specific and intense, a space where clever people compete for dominance and where the social dynamics of the room have direct effects on what ends up in the show. The Simpsons writers' room has been described by veterans as alternately exhilarating and brutal, a place where the standard of comedy was so high and the pace of production so demanding that the pressure was constant and the casualties, in terms of burned-out writers and abandoned creative relationships, were numerous. Several writers who spent time in the room have described an informal hierarchy in which certain voices consistently dominated the creative conversation, while others were systematically marginalized. The episodes that emerge from any given season reflect this dynamic in ways that aren't always visible without context. Certain episodes feel like they were written by someone who had something to prove. Others feel like they were written by someone who was exhausted. Others feel like compromises between competing visions that neither satisfies nor fully disappoints. The remarkable thing is how often, given all of this, the episodes still work. The production machinery, the animation quality, the performances, and the foundation of genuinely great characters and a genuinely rich fictional world provide a baseline of quality that the show can fall back on, even when the writer's room is at its most conflicted. But when the conflicts do bleed through, when an episode carries the marks of a story that almost went somewhere else, that knowledge adds a layer to the experience of watching. You're not just watching a cartoon. You're watching the record of a creative decision made under pressure by a group of people who cared about what they were making, who argued about it, who compromised on it, and who eventually had to let it go and move on to the next week's episode. That's the real story behind any given Simpsons episode. And occasionally, if you look carefully, you can feel it. Number Section 9. The deaths that stuck, a full accounting of permanent loss in Springfield. Springfield is a town where most things reset. Characters survive disasters that should be fatal. Events that should leave permanent marks are forgotten by the next episode. The show's fundamental operating principle is that the Simpsons family and their world are resilient in ways that defy realistic causality. Things go wrong and then, reliably, they go right again. But some things don't reset. For all of the show's reputation for consequence-free storytelling, there is a surprisingly large number of deaths in The Simpsons that are treated as permanent, as real, as things that the show acknowledges happened and doesn't walk back. These deaths are distributed across the show's run in ways that reveal patterns about what the show treats as sacred, about what it's willing to use as comedy, and what it insists on treating as tragedy. Maud Flanders is the most discussed of these, and her death represents a pivotal moment in the show's relationship with its own consequences. As noted earlier, Maud's death was driven by a production dispute, but the show committed to it completely. Ned's grief was sustained across multiple subsequent episodes. The absence of Maud was treated as real. Years later, when Ned remarried in a story involving a schoolteacher named Edna Krabappel, the show treated Maud's memory with respect, even in the middle of a new romantic arc. Edna Krabappel is herself one of the permanent deaths, and her case is similar to Maud's in being driven by real-world circumstance rather than purely creative choice. Marcia Wallace, the actress who voiced Edna, died in October 2013 from pneumonia. Her death was acknowledged within the show with a dedication, and Edna's character was retired rather than recast. The schoolteacher who had tormented and occasionally shown surprising tenderness to Bart for 24 seasons was gone. The show honored this quietly. Edna's empty chair, an "I, Edna" message chalked on the Simpsons' driveway in the episode that followed her death. The retirement of her desk at Springfield Elementary. These are small gestures, but they accumulate into something that feels appropriate. A recognition that Edna Krabappel was a real part of Springfield's world and that her absence would leave a real mark. Frank Grimes, as discussed, is dead. His death is permanent. The show has referenced it in subsequent episodes in ways that establish it as part of Springfield's history. Homer's reaction to Grimes's death, which is to fall asleep at the funeral and mumble about something unrelated, has never been revisited or recontextualized. Homer didn't learn anything from Frank Grimes. Springfield didn't learn anything. The town witnessed a man destroyed by the impossibility of living by ordinary rules in an extraordinary place, and it laughed and moved on. The death of Frank Grimes is permanent because making it impermanent would undermine the only point the episode was making. Bart's substitute teacher, Mr. Bergstrom, from the episode Lisa's Substitute, doesn't die, but he leaves, which, in the economy of Springfield's relationships, functions similarly. He was the first adult outside her family who saw Lisa fully, who understood what she was and reflected it back to her without judgment or condescension. He left, as substitute teachers do, because the position was temporary. And he gave Lisa a note to read when she felt most alone, a note that said simply, "You are Lisa Simpson." The episode has no villain. Nobody did anything wrong. Mr. Bergstrom left because leaving was always going to happen. But the mark his departure left on Lisa and on the audience is permanent. The show's treatment of this kind of loss, the loss of people who briefly made things better and then were gone, is one of its most quietly devastating qualities. Not everyone who disappears from Springfield's story dies. Some just leave. And the leaving can hurt as much as the dying, especially when the person who left was the one person who made someone feel less alone. Mrs. Glick, one of Springfield's elderly residents who appears in a Season 3 episode as a kind of moral counterpoint to the town's general self-interest, is a character who appeared and then quietly stopped appearing across subsequent seasons. Her death is never established. She's simply not there. In Springfield, this is how most things end. Not with a formal ending, but with a fade, an absence that the town adjusts to without comment. Sideshow Bob's various victims across the show's run represent a particular kind of permanent death, the death that almost was, because Bob has been attempting to kill Bart across dozens of episodes without success. But the trail of actual deaths associated with Bob's criminal career, the people referenced in legal proceedings and in his documented criminal history, those are real within the show's universe. They don't appear on screen in most cases, but their reality is established, and Bob's transformation from Krusty's sidekick to convicted murderer has a body count that the show acknowledges without fully depicting. The most unusual category of permanent death in The Simpsons is the one that involves characters who die and are treated as dead in their episode but whose deaths the show does not fully commit to across the larger continuity. Dr. Nick Riviera, Springfield's incompetent physician, appears to die on screen in the Simpsons movie when the dome scenario results in chaos, but he returns in subsequent episodes with no acknowledgement of his apparent death. This places him in a strange limbo, a character whose death was depicted but not committed to, which creates a small inconsistency that the show has never addressed. This pattern of deaths that occur within specific narrative contexts and are then quietly reversed or ignored is more common than the show's reputation for permanent consequences might suggest. Several characters who appear to die in Treehouse of Horror episodes, technically non-canonical, have also appeared to die in regular episodes without those deaths sticking. The question of what the show considers binding, which deaths it will honor and which it will treat as negotiable, reveals something about its hierarchy of narrative commitment. The permanent deaths, the ones that stick, cluster around characters whose deaths serve a specific function. Maud's death changed Ned. Edna's death honored a real-world loss. Frank Grimes's death completed the only argument his existence was making. These are deaths with purposes. The deaths that don't stick tend to be deaths without purposes, character deaths that serve only their immediate episode story without implications for anything larger. The show knows which deaths matter. It treats them accordingly. And the fact that it has the discipline to honor the meaningful deaths, even in a production environment that is fundamentally predisposed toward reset, speaks to something important about what The Simpsons, at its best, understands about loss. Number Section 10. The Treehouse of Horror canon. Are the horror episodes real? Every October, The Simpsons abandons its commitment to continuity and does something extraordinary. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which have been a feature of the show since the second season, are the space where The Simpsons goes to do things it cannot do in its regular run. Characters die, the laws of physics dissolve. Genres are played straight and then subverted. The show takes its familiar characters and places them in scenarios designed to generate genuine unease alongside the comedy. They're anthology episodes, typically containing 3 segments of varying length, usually tied together by a framing device that has evolved considerably over the years. The framing has been Bart and Lisa telling scary stories in a treehouse. It's been a horror movie opening. It's been Marge directly addressing the audience to warn them about the disturbing content they're about to see. The format has been flexible, but the intent has always been the same: to do things The Simpsons can do in October that it cannot do in any other month. The official position on these episodes is that they're non-canonical, that the events depicted in them don't count for the show's main continuity, that Homer dying is funny rather than troubling, because none of it is real within the show's universe. This position is broadly accepted and has allowed the Treehouse episodes to accumulate an enormous body of extreme content without that content impacting the main show in any lasting way. But the non-canonical designation deserves scrutiny, because the evidence for it is less complete than the conventional wisdom suggests. Let's start with the simplest version of the argument. The Treehouse episodes are non-canonical because the show tells us they are. The framing devices in many of them explicitly mark the content as a story being told, as a performance, as something happening in a space outside the show's normal reality. The credits use horror-themed parody names. The music is different. The visual palette shifts. The show is clearly signaling that you should not integrate these events into your understanding of the main show. But here's the complication. The main show doesn't always honor this designation. Treehouse of Horror content has been referenced in regular episodes more times than is comfortable for the strictly non-canonical position. Background details from Treehouse segments have appeared in regular episodes. Characters in main continuity episodes have occasionally mentioned or responded to events that, if taken literally, could only have occurred in Treehouse contexts. And at least a few plot elements that were first explored in Treehouse segments were subsequently adapted for regular episodes in ways that suggest the Treehouse material was treated as available creative material rather than as genuinely separate from the show's world. There is also the question of the show's reality principle in a more philosophical sense. The Simpsons' reality is already so flexible, so internally contradictory, so resistant to stable factual mapping, that the designation of certain episodes as non-canonical may be less meaningful than it appears. If the main show already treats continuity as negotiable and reality as elastic, what does it mean for something to be outside that reality? The Treehouse episodes do things that the main show can't, but the main show already does things that real life can't. The gap between them is one of degree rather than kind. And when that gap narrows sufficiently, as it does in the most extreme examples of the main show's surrealist episodes, the line between the Treehouse horror canon and the regular show's canon becomes very difficult to locate. There's a specific episode worth examining here. In a Season 21 regular non-Treehouse episode, An event occurs that would have been perfectly at home in a treehouse context. The episode involves supernatural elements, characters behaving in ways that violate physical reality, and an ending that doesn't resolve its impossible events in any realistic way. This episode is treated as canonical. Its events are referenced in subsequent episodes. The supernatural elements it introduces are not explained or walk back. By any reasonable definition of Treehouse of Horror, this episode qualifies, and yet it's a regular episode with full canonical status. This suggests that the boundary between the treehouse and the main show is more porous than the official position acknowledges, and that what gets designated as treehouse content versus what gets treated as regular continuity is at least partially arbitrary. The horror content of the treehouse episodes themselves has evolved dramatically across the show's run. The first treehouse episode, from Season 2, is built around relatively gentle horror content, a haunted house, a send-up of the Raven, an alien abduction played for comedy. By comparison, later treehouse episodes have depicted mass murder, systematic genocide, physical horror that would be completely at home in an adult horror film, and psychological horror that in some cases is more disturbing than anything in the show's regular run. This escalation parallels the history of the show's regular content in some ways, a gradual willingness to go further than the previous season went. But the treehouse escalation has been considerably steeper because the non-canonical framing removed the guardrails that the main show had to operate within. The result is that the later treehouse episodes contain some of the show's most genuinely unsettling material, presented in a context that invites the audience to experience it as comedy, while also experiencing it as something else. Take the treehouse segment that parodies the premise of Survivor by depicting Springfieldians stranded on an island. In its treehouse version, the segment goes places that the premise's natural conclusion demands, but that regular television would not depict. Characters are killed. The survivor is revealed as the monster of the piece rather than the hero. The show commits to the logic of its horror premise rather than finding the comfortable exit that regular continuity would require. This is the treehouse's genuine function. Not just to do horror content, but to follow premises to their actual conclusions, rather than the conclusions the main show's requirements dictate. The treehouse episodes are what happens when The Simpsons removes its own hand from the scale. And occasionally, what follows from premises when you remove the hand from the scale is deeply, genuinely disturbing. Not because of gore or violence or explicit content, but because the show's intelligence, applied to horror material without the usual constraints, produces observations about human nature that are more uncomfortable than any monster it's ever depicted. The episode involving Springfield's children being systematically fattened for consumption by their teachers is disturbing not because of what it depicts, but because of what it's saying about institutional systems and the people within them who participate without question. The episode is comedy. It's a spoof of a recognizable horror premise. But the observation underneath it, about compliance and about what people are willing to do within institutional frameworks, is a serious one. And the treehouse format allows it to be made seriously. There is a theory in the fan community that the treehouse episodes are not non-canonical, but rather hyper-canonical, that they're the moments when the show's unconscious content surfaces most completely. Under this theory, the treehouse episodes reveal what the main show's continuity would look like if the constraints of network television, family audience expectations, and the show's comedic brand were removed. They're the id to the main show's superego. Under this reading, the patterns in treehouse content across the show's run are diagnostically significant in the same way that dream content is diagnostically significant. The recurring themes, authority figures revealed as predatory, familiar domesticity revealed as horror, the specific character who gets killed most often and how they die, all of this tells you something about what the show is anxious about, what it's working through, what it cannot say directly in its regular voice but says in the treehouse when it thinks nobody is taking it literally. Homer dying in treehouse episodes is a recurring feature across the show's history. He dies more often and in more ways in the treehouse than any other character. Some deaths are played purely for laughs, but some have a quality of relief to them, of finality, of the world briefly permitted to respond to Homer Simpson the way it would if Springfield were a real place with real consequences. The treehouse gives the show permission to kill Homer in the ways his life should, by normal logic, have already killed him. And the frequency with which it uses that permission says something about the accumulated weight of his impossible survival across the main show's run. The most distilling of all the Treehouse content, the thing that most clearly reveals what the format is doing underneath its horror costumes, is the segment Homer's Brain from an early Treehouse. The segment depicts Homer's thought process as a literal visualization, showing the inside of his mind as a physical space with observable features. What it shows is devastating in its comedy. Homer's brain is a place of constant, low-grade suffering, interrupted by moments of simple pleasure. The suffering is not dramatic. It's the suffering of ordinary limitation, of wanting things you can't have and having things you don't want. The comedy emerges from the accuracy of this, from the recognition that Homer's interior life is not the interior life of a cartoon buffoon, but of an ordinary person navigating the same cognitive and emotional terrain that ordinary people navigate every day. That Treehouse segment, in 7 minutes of comedy horror, does something the main show rarely manages to do directly, which is to make Homer Simpson fully human by making his inner life fully visible. Whatever the Treehouse's canonical status, that moment is real. It has the quality of truth, and truth doesn't become non-canonical just because it's delivered in an October costume. Number Section 11. The deeper mythology, religion, philosophy, and what Springfield actually believes. Springfield is a deeply religious town that has almost no faith. This is one of the show's most carefully maintained tensions. The church is central to Springfield's social life. Reverend Lovejoy is a fixture of the community. Ned Flanders's devout Christianity functions as a sustained moral touchstone against which other characters are measured. The show references God, scripture, prayer, and religious practice constantly, and with a specificity that suggests the writers have engaged seriously with the material. And yet Springfield's functional relationship with religion, the relationship visible in how the town actually behaves rather than in what it professes, is one of the show's most melancholy aspects. The church is there, people attend it, and then they go home and behave in ways that bear essentially no relationship to anything they might have heard there. This is not, the show seems to suggest, hypocrisy in the simple sense. It's something more structural. Springfield's relationship to religion follows the same pattern as its relationship to everything else in its civic life. The institutional forms are maintained. The appearances are kept. The underlying reality is something different. Springfield attends church the same way it attends town meetings, and reads the Springfield Shopper, and participates in civic life, as a set of social forms whose original function has been largely evacuated, without the forms themselves being discontinued. The God problem is most explicitly addressed in the episode Homer the Heretic, which we've touched on before in the context of the coma theory. In this episode, Homer decides to stop attending church and discovers that his Sundays are immediately more pleasurable without the obligation. He sleeps in, he eats, he watches television. He has what might be the best Sunday of his adult life. And then he has a dream in which God appears to him directly, in person, and they have a conversation. The show treats this as a real occurrence within its universe. God appears to Homer, Homer talks to God. God is personified with specific physical characteristics he's depicted, without his face fully shown, which is a different approach than some other depictions of God in the show, and with a personality that is surprisingly personable, even a little world-weary. This is a God who seems to find Homer's situation genuinely interesting. The conversation between Homer and God in this episode is one of the most theologically interesting exchanges in the show's history. Homer asks questions. God answers some of them and declines to answer others. The God of this episode is not an omnipotent dispenser of easy comfort. He's a figure who seems to understand the limitations of his own project, who is somewhat resigned to the gap between what religion is supposed to do and what it actually does in practice. And then the episode ends with Homer's house catching fire, Homer being saved by the non-church attending members of his community, and Reverend Lovejoy delivering the interpretation that God works through everyone, including the faithless. Homer agrees to return to church. The crisis resolves. The question of what Homer's direct conversation with God means for his understanding of reality is dropped without resolution. This is the show's theological move, over and over. It raises the question honestly and then resolves it at the social rather than the metaphysical level. Homer goes back to church not because God answered his questions about faith, but because his community helped him, and community solidarity is mediated through institutions like church. The divine is real in Springfield, but its reality doesn't resolve anything. It's just another fact of the town's strange existence, like three-eyed fish and a billionaire who glows in the dark. The show's approach to religious diversity is worth examining. Springfield has Jewish characters, primarily Krusty the Clown and his family, and the show's engagement with Krusty's Judaism is one of its more sustained examples of a religious identity portrayed with specific detail. Krusty's complex, guilty, ambivalent relationship with his faith and his father is explored in several episodes, particularly Like Father, Like Clown, which adapts the jazz singer premise to Springfield's specific context. What the Krusty episodes reveal about Springfield's religious landscape is that the town's religious diversity is real, but that different faiths operate within the same framework of institutional form without corresponding inner life. Krusty's estrangement from his father, a rabbi, is driven by his choice of profession, clown, over the rabbinical path his father had planned for him. The estrangement is resolved in the episode through a reconciliation scene that is both funny and genuinely moving. But what makes it moving is not the religious content specifically. It's the father-son reconciliation, the universal dynamic underneath the specific Jewish cultural context. This is the show's consistent approach to religious content. The specific religious forms provide texture and dramatic structure. The emotional reality underneath them is universal. Springfield's Jews and Christians and occasional practitioners of other faiths are all navigating the same human experiences through different institutional frameworks, and the show treats those frameworks with respect without suggesting that any of them is providing what it's supposed to provide. The philosophy of Springfield, as distinct from its religion, is perhaps more interesting in what it reveals about the show's underlying worldview. Springfield is a deeply pragmatic place. Its ethical commitments are shallow and easily overridden by immediate self-interest, not because its residents are uniquely bad people, but because the town's social structure does not reward ethical consistency. People who behave well in Springfield do not fare better than people who don't. The show has established this pattern with Ned Flanders as the primary evidence, but it's visible across the supporting cast as well. The Springfield that has emerged over 36 seasons of storytelling is a place where pragmatic accommodation is the dominant survival strategy. The people who insist on ethical consistency are the ones who suffer. The people who adapt their ethics to circumstances are the ones who muddle through. And the people who have no meaningful ethical commitments at all, Burns being the extreme example, are the ones who thrive. This is a fairly dark, implicit philosophy for a comedy about a lovable family. And the show is generally smart enough not to state it directly, not to draw the conclusion out of the evidence it provides. It presents the evidence, through the stories it tells and the fates it assigns to its characters, and leaves the conclusion for the audience to draw. But occasionally the philosophy surfaces more explicitly. The episode Marge Be Not Proud, in which Bart is caught shoplifting a video game, handles this with more directness than usual. Bart's ethical failure, his choice to steal, is taken seriously by the episode. The consequence he faces is not legal but familial, specifically the temporary cooling of his relationship with Marge, the person whose opinion of him matters most. The episode treats this consequence as genuinely devastating, and the resolution involves Bart doing something selfless, buying a framed photo for Marge to restore what was broken. The ethics here are simple and real. You damage a relationship through your choices, and you repair it through different choices, through demonstrating that you can do something for someone else without asking for anything in return. This is not a complicated philosophical position, but it is one of the show's clearest statements of what ethical behavior actually means in Springfield. Not adherence to abstract principles, but maintenance of the relationships that constitute your life. The show's philosophical position on the big questions, on what life is for, on what constitutes a good life, on whether any of the ethical and religious frameworks Springfield participates in have any relationship to truth, is expressed most clearly in the episode The Joy of Sect. This episode depicts Springfield's entire adult population being recruited into a cult called the Movementarians, who promise their followers a journey to the planet Blistonia. The episode is both a specific satire of cult psychology and a more general meditation on Springfield's vulnerability to any sufficiently organized system of false promises. What the episode reveals is that Springfield's residents are not especially credulous. They're not uniquely susceptible to deception. They're susceptible in the same way that any community of people who have been disappointed by the available explanations for their situation is susceptible. The Movementarians succeed not because they are better at deception than anyone else, But because they arrive at a moment when Springfield's residents are sufficiently dissatisfied with their existing frameworks that a new one, even an obviously absurd one, is welcome. This is the show's philosophical statement about religion, ideology, and meaning-making in general. People don't adopt belief systems because those belief systems are true. They adopt them because they fill a need, and Springfield is a place where the needs are large and the available fillers are inadequate. The residents will adopt whatever framework is offered because the alternative, examining their situation without any framework at all, is more than they can bear. Which brings us to the deepest philosophical question the show poses, and the one it never answers. Is any of it worth it? Is the life of an ordinary person in an ordinary place, with ordinary joys and ordinary disappointments and ordinary failures of courage and ordinary moments of love, worth the living? The Simpsons has been asking this question for 36 years without providing a direct answer. Every episode that ends with the family together, with some crisis resolved and some version of normalcy restored, gestures toward yes. Every episode that reveals the accumulated damage of Springfield's impossible situation, the poisoned water and the corrupted institutions, and the cognitive erosion and the systemic oppression of everyone who tries to challenge the status quo, gestures toward something more complicated. The show's answer, to the extent that it has one, is expressed in the couch gag. Every episode begins with the family rushing home to sit on the couch together. The couch gag variations are elaborate, absurd, sometimes extended into miniature episodes of their own, but the basic action is always the same. They run home, they sit together, they watch television. In Springfield, this is what it means to be home. Not safety, not comfort, not any meaningful protection from the forces that are damaging all of them in ways they can't fully perceive or resist. Just the couch, just the family, just the ritual of sitting together at the end of the day. The Simpsons' answer to the question of whether it's worth it is that the question is answered by repetition rather than by argument. You come home. You sit down, you're together. You do it again tomorrow. That's Springfield's philosophy. Small, specific, domestic, imperfect. And despite everything the show knows about Springfield's darkness, it returns to that couch every week as if it's enough. Because maybe, for now, it is. Number, Section 12. The final tier. The theories so deep, even the fanbase forgot them. This is the bottom of the iceberg. What lives down here isn't the famous theories. The coma, the radiation, the who shot Burns debates, these are the upper middle depths, well-trodden territory for dedicated fans. What lives at the actual bottom are the theories and observations and connections that the fan community encountered, briefly engaged with, and then set aside. Not because they were disproven, but because they were too strange, too uncomfortable, or too structurally demanding to maintain. These are the theories that require you to hold multiple complex ideas in your head simultaneously without any single organizing framework to contain them. They don't resolve into clean narratives, they suggest things rather than state them. They're the residue at the bottom of 36 years of excavation, the material that wouldn't fit any of the categories above. Let's start with the oldest of these, a theory that predates the internet's engagement with Simpsons mythology and that circulated in early fan communities before the show had acquired even a fraction of its current cultural weight. In the very first seasons of the show, before it had established the conventions of its own universe, there was a quality to certain episodes that several of the show's earliest critics and fans described as a kind of metaphysical density. The show seemed, in those early episodes, to be groping towards something. Not just a family comedy, but something about what family means, about why the domestic unit has the specific psychological shape it has, about what it costs people to love each other in the conditions that ordinary life provides. The theory that emerged from this observation is that The Simpsons was always, from its earliest conception, a show about grief. Not about any specific loss, not grief as a subject, but grief as an operating condition. The show's fundamental emotional substrate, the thing beneath every joke and every warm moment and every family resolution, is the grief of people who know that what they have is temporary, but who cannot bear to acknowledge this and so behave as if nothing will ever change. Homer's grief for his mother, compressed into a shape he can't fully recognize. Marge's grief for the version of herself she surrendered to the demands of family. Bart's grief for the trust and innocence that school and society have been systematically extracting from him since before he was old enough to name what was happening. Lisa's grief for the world's failure to meet her halfway. Even Burns, even his armored, weaponized rejection of sentiment, carries a grief at its center. The grief of a very old man who has outlived everyone he ever knew and who has substituted power for the connections that loss made impossible to maintain. The couch gag under this theory is not just a running joke or a signature. It's the show's recurring image of what families do with their grief. They come home, they sit together, they watch something in the middle distance, and they don't talk about what's really happening. The couch is where Springfield's families contain their grief, and the gag that shows the various ways that sitting on the couch can go wrong, the falling ceiling, the shrinking family, the wrong couch, the wrong living room, the entire house collapsing around them, is the show acknowledging what it knows but won't say plainly. The containment doesn't always hold. The next deep theory involves something that's been in the show from the beginning and that the fan community has consistently under-discussed relative to more dramatic theories. It's about Maggie. We've established elsewhere that Maggie is extraordinary in ways the show keeps pointing to without fully committing to. Her intelligence, her silence, her demonstrated capacity for action that exceeds anything a child her age should be capable of. But there is a layer to the Maggie analysis that goes deeper than her individual capabilities, and it involves the specific relationship between Maggie and the show's temporal logic. Maggie has been 1 year old for 36 years. This is true of every character, the floating timeline, the show's commitment to an eternal present. But Maggie's temporal suspension has a quality that's different from Bart's or Lisa's or Homer's because Maggie's 1 year old status carries with it a specific set of developmental implications that the other characters' ages don't. A 1 year old is, developmentally, in the most critical period of human development. The period of most rapid neurological growth, the period in which language is being acquired, in which the basic architecture of personality and cognition is being laid down, in which attachment relationships are forming the template for every relationship that will follow. Every day of a 1 year old's life represents more developmental change than any subsequent year until adolescence. Maggie has been experiencing this period of radical developmental flux for 36 years. This is not a situation any developmental framework can accommodate. A child who remains in the developmental state of early infancy for 3 decades has not been developing normally. They've been suspended, and whatever has suspended them has done so at the precise moment when the most foundational processes of human formation are occurring. The question the theory poses is, what does Maggie have access to that other Springfield residents don't, by virtue of being permanently in this developmental state? A 1 year old is operating primarily on pattern recognition and emotional attunement. Language-based thought has not yet established itself as the dominant cognitive mode. The sophisticated verbal reasoning that will eventually structure the mind hasn't yet overwritten the earlier, more directly perceptual ways of knowing the world. A 1 year old sees things that older children and adults have learned not to see because the structures of language and category and cause and effect narrative haven't yet been fully installed as filters on experience. If Maggie has been suspended in this state, then she is perceiving Springfield with a cognitive mode that no other Springfield resident has access to. She's not seeing it through the filters of language-based rationalization. She's not seeing it through the accumulated stories the town tells about itself. She's seeing it directly, perceptually, with the unfiltered attentiveness of permanent infancy. This is why she notices things. This is why she acts when others don't. This is why she has saved the family in ways that adult reasoning would not have found. She's not operating by the same cognitive rules as everyone else in Springfield. She predates those rules, and 36 years of predating them has made her, in some sense, the only person in Springfield who sees the town as it actually is rather than as the stories it tells about itself. The theory doesn't have a tidy conclusion. It's a way of understanding Maggie that's consistent with the evidence the show provides, and it raises a question that the show has never answered. What, exactly, does Maggie see? What has she been observing for 36 years from her position as the family's most observant member, with the most unfiltered cognitive access to whatever Springfield actually is? The show's answer, as always, is silence. Maggie watches, Maggie knows, and the rest of Springfield lives inside its own stories without knowing what the baby in the corner perceives. The deepest theory, the one at the very bottom of this iceberg's descent, involves not a specific character or a specific episode, but the show's relationship with its own audience across 36 years. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. People who were 10 years old at that premiere are 46 now. People who were born in 1989 are 36. The show has been running for the entirety of some of its current viewers' lives, and for longer than most of the people watching it have been alive. This is an extraordinary thing. There is no other piece of entertainment that has been continuously present in American culture for this long while remaining in active production. What this means is that for a significant portion of the Simpsons audience, the show is not something they chose to become attached to. It's something they were born into. The Simpsons was there when they first became aware of television. It was there through their childhood. It was there through their adolescence and their early adulthood and their midlife, and for some viewers, it's been there through their entire conscious existence. The show has watched us grow up. We have not watched the show grow up because the show doesn't age, but we have changed around it, and its unchangingness has become, over time, a part of how we understand our own change. We know we're older because the Simpsons are still the same. This is the function the floating timeline serves at a cultural rather than a narrative level. The show's refusal to age is not just a production convenience, it's a service. It's holding still while everything else moves, so that we have something to triangulate from. You know where you are partly by knowing where the Simpsons are, which is always in the same place. The distance between where you are now and where you were when you first understood what this show was, that distance is yours. The show doesn't carry it, you do. And the show's stillness makes the measurement possible. This is why the iceberg goes so deep, not because The Simpsons contains more hidden content than any other piece of entertainment, though its 36 years of production do mean it contains more total material than almost anything else, but because the show's relationship with time, its relationship with the audience's time specifically, has made it a repository for a specific kind of meaning that accumulates through duration rather than through deliberate content. Every theory that has ever been generated about The Simpsons is, at some level, a theory about what the show means to the person generating it. The radiation theory is a theory about institutional corruption and its effects on ordinary people. The coma theory is a theory about love and loss and what we hold on to when we're afraid we're losing everything. The Maggie theory is a theory about what it means to see clearly in a world that rewards not seeing. The founding myths theory is a theory about the lies that communities require to maintain themselves. All of these are also theories about the people who generated them, about what they're working through, about what they're trying to understand by looking at a cartoon that has been in their lives for as long as they can remember. The Simpsons provided the material, the audience provided the meaning, and the dialogue between these two things, the show's strange, massive, detailed, contradictory, beautiful body of content, and the audience's decades of engagement with it, has produced something that isn't fully explicable by either the show or the audience alone. The iceberg image is useful up to a point, but at the very bottom, in the deepest water where the light doesn't reach, the iceberg is no longer a discrete object. It's continuous with the ocean floor. It's part of the geology of the place. You can't separate it from the ground it rests on. The Simpsons, at the bottom of the iceberg, is not a television show with hidden depths. It's part of the geological formation of the last 3 decades of American culture. It's in the bedrock. You can excavate it, analyze it, theorize about it. You can spend hundreds of hours and thousands of words and still not reach the bottom. But eventually you have to accept that the bottom isn't a place you find. It's a place you recognize when you realize you've stopped being an external observer looking down into the iceberg, and you've become part of the water around it. Springfield got into the water a long time ago. You're swimming in it. We all are. And so, after 36 years of episodes, after this night's long descent through the levels of what The Simpsons has been hiding in plain sight, we arrive at the same place every Springfield story arrives. The couch, the family, the television, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow everything resets. Homer will go back to the plant, Marge will hold the household together, Bart will find some new avenue for creative disruption, Lisa will keep asking the questions nobody wants answered, and Maggie will watch from her corner of the couch, quiet and enormous-eyed, and carrying whatever it is she carries, waiting for the moment that is either never going to come or is always, in some sense, already here. The iceberg goes deeper than this. It always goes deeper. There are theories not covered here, production histories not documented, background details not yet found. The show has been running for 36 years and will probably keep running, and every new episode adds more material to the iceberg, more to find, more to excavate, more to wonder about in the quiet hours when the world is still and the television is on, and the Springfield opening theme is playing somewhere in your memory. Wherever you are right now, whatever hour it is, whatever brought you here tonight, we're glad you're here. Number expanded section. The deeper strangeness of Springfield's daily life. There is a layer of Springfield's existence that falls between the grand theories and the production history. A layer made of smaller, quieter observations about the fabric of daily life in the town. These observations don't generate headlines in the fan community. They don't have names. But they accumulate into something that rewards the kind of sustained attention that most viewing doesn't afford. Consider, for instance, the economics of Springfield. The Simpson family's financial situation has been an ongoing subject throughout the show's run, depicted with a casual inconsistency that, like the house's impossible floor plan, resists any coherent single reading. Homer's salary at the nuclear power plant has been variously implied, occasionally stated, and never definitively established. What the show makes clear is that the family lives in a state of perpetual mild financial precariousness, that large expenses require genuine sacrifice or creative solution, that the comfortable middle-class existence they maintain is maintained narrowly and through effort. This economic reality, grounded and recognizable in the early seasons, becomes progressively harder to reconcile with the show's later season plotting. Episodes in which Homer and Marge can afford significant travel, elaborate purchases, or expensive experiences sit awkwardly alongside episodes in which the cost of a single appliance represents a genuine family crisis. The economics of Springfield, like its geography, have become elastic, reshaping themselves around what any given episode requires, rather than maintaining the internal consistency that the early seasons attempted. But what's interesting about this inconsistency, when you look at it carefully, is the direction in which it tends to flex. When the economics of Springfield need to be constrained, they constrain in ways that feel emotionally resonant rather than financially precise. The cost that matters in any given episode is the cost that the story can make meaningful. The financial pressure in the gambling episode is not about a specific number. It's about the specific quality of anxiety that accompanies the fear of losing control of something that feels essential. The financial freedom in the travel episodes is not about a specific income level. It's about the story's need to place the characters somewhere new. Springfield's economy, then, is calibrated to emotional truth rather than financial consistency. This is the same principle we identified in the house's impossible floor plan. The spaces, including the economic spaces, are sized for what needs to happen in them. And what needs to happen is always, finally, something about the family and their relationships, something about love and need, and how people navigate difficulty together. The food culture of Springfield deserves its own extended consideration, because the show has been extraordinarily consistent in one specific area of Homer's characterization, even when it's been inconsistent about almost everything else. Homer's relationship with food is the most stable element of his depiction across the show's entire run. His capacity for and relationship with eating is the one thing that never changes register, never becomes uncertain, never requires reestablishment. This is Homer at the level of pure need, below psychology and socialization, and the accumulated damage of everything that has happened to his cognition. What the show does with Homer's eating that elevates it beyond a simple character tic is the specific quality of pleasure it depicts. Homer's pleasure in food is total, undivided, uncomplicated by the self-consciousness or the cultural mediation that most adult human relationships with eating involve. He eats the way a person eats who is not thinking about eating, who is experiencing it entirely rather than observing the experience from some removed position. This kind of unmediated sensory pleasure is, in the show's universe, presented as one of the things Homer has that more cognitively sophisticated people often don't. He is fully present in the moment of eating in a way that is not available to people whose continuous internal monologue prevents the kind of total absorption Homer achieves. This is one of the show's most counterintuitive emotional moves. Homer's intellectual limitations, which are the source of so much of his pain and so much of the damage he causes, are also the source of his access to a kind of presence and pleasure that his more complicated family members struggle to reach. Lisa, who thinks about everything, cannot eat a donut the way Homer eats a donut. Marge, who manages everything, cannot sit on a couch the way Homer sits on a couch. The cognitive load they carry prevents the total absorption that Homer achieves through the specific limitation of not being able to think about more than one thing at once. The show never states this. It shows it. In the animation of Homer's face during eating scenes, in the sound design that gives particular attention to the sensory quality of the food Homer is eating, in the specific way the comedy of his gluttony coexists with a kind of genuine joy that makes you slightly envious rather than merely contemptuous. Homer's relationship with food is the show's most sustained portrait of a particular kind of happiness, simple and profound and available primarily to people who haven't been educated out of it. The background characters of Springfield constitute a subject that becomes richer the more systematically you examine them. The show has maintained a large population of recurring background characters across its run, figures who appear in various Springfield locations without consistent characterization or storyline, but who are present enough to feel like part of the town's texture. Hans Moleman, Sideshow Mel, Crazy Cat Lady, Professor Frink, Disco Stew. Each of these characters represents a specific approach to the comic portrait of Springfield's social margin. What's interesting about this background ensemble, collectively, is what it says about Springfield as a social environment. The characters who occupy the town's margins tend to be people who are characterized by some form of social or cognitive difference, people who relate to Springfield's conventional social life from an angle rather than straight on. Springfield's margin, its population of unusual figures who don't quite fit the suburban normative template, is large and specific, and consistently depicted with a quality of affection that the show doesn't always extend to its more central characters. Hans Moleman, the character who dies and returns most frequently, whose stated age of 31 clashes so dramatically with his apparent physical age of approximately 90, is the most extreme example of this. He is depicted with a consistency that the show's narrative logic cannot quite accommodate, someone who exists at the absolute limit of what Springfield's reality will sustain, dying repeatedly in ways that should be permanent and returning without explanation. In this he functions as a kind of limit case, the figure who reveals, through his impossible resilience, the boundary conditions of Springfield's reality. If you accept the radiation theory, Moleman is the mutation that went furthest in the direction of cellular alteration. If you accept the coma theory, he's a background process, a minor character that Homer's dreaming mind doesn't care enough about to retire. If you accept the collective denial framework, he's just another Springfield anomaly that the town has agreed not to find alarming. The three-eyed fish in the river, the baby who shot the billionaire, the tiny old man who keeps dying and coming back. These are just the things that happen in Springfield, and Springfield has agreed to find them unremarkable. The Springfield School deserves extended attention as an institution because it's the show's most sustained depiction of how institutional failure looks when it's so complete that the people within the institution have stopped perceiving it as failure. Springfield Elementary is an under-resourced, poorly managed, inconsistently staffed school that produces outcomes so poor that they are themselves a recurring source of comedy. The underfunding is a recurring plot element. The teaching quality ranges from mediocre to catastrophically bad, with occasional exceptions in the form of individual teachers who are competent but who never last. The physical infrastructure of the school, its building, its equipment, its supplies, is in a state of deterioration that the show references with enough specificity to constitute a portrait of genuine institutional neglect. But what makes Springfield Elementary interesting as a subject is not its failure as an institution, but the way its failure is normalized by everyone within it. Principal Skinner navigates the institution with a kind of resigned competence, managing the gap between what he knows good education should be and what Springfield Elementary actually provides, through a combination of bureaucratic creativity and deliberate lowered expectation. The teachers who persist in the institution, the ones who stay rather than fleeing for better schools in better-funded districts, have made peace with a version of teaching that would be unrecognizable to the professional standard they presumably trained toward. And the children, Bart and Lisa and their classmates, have developed their own adaptations to an institution that consistently fails them. Bart's adaptation, which we've discussed, is opt-out and redirect. Lisa's adaptation is internal construction, building a rich inner educational life through private study and private passion that runs parallel to and largely independent of what the school nominally provides. Other children in Springfield Elementary's classrooms appear to have made peace with simply not being educated, with the institution's failure being so complete and so consistent that it no longer registers as failure but as baseline. This normalization of institutional failure is one of the show's most politically pointed observations, and it's made almost entirely through accumulated detail rather than through explicit statement. The show never gives a speech about public education, It just shows you Springfield Elementary, year after year, in its specific state of managed dysfunction, and trusts that the picture it builds is clear enough to carry the observation without needing to be stated. Number, the mythology of recurring locations. Springfield's recurring locations each carry their own mythology, a body of associations and narrative history that accumulates across the show's run and makes each of them something more than a simple setting. Moe's Tavern has been discussed as a spatial subject. As a social subject, it deserves equal attention. Moe's is not a pleasant bar. It is objectively not a nice place. The decor is depressing. The clientele is limited. The proprietor is deeply unhappy. The beer is of uncertain quality. By any objective measure, the appeal of Moe's Tavern as a place to spend time is not immediately obvious. And yet Homer returns there, episode after episode, across 36 years of storytelling. The tavern is the second most important location in Homer's life after his own home, and in some episodes it competes with the home for primacy. This persistence raises a question that the show answers only obliquely. Why does Homer go to Moe's? The obvious answer is that Homer is an alcoholic, and Moe's is where the alcohol is. The show has addressed Homer's drinking with more directness than its detractors usually credit. And the alcoholism reading is available throughout the run, visible in the specific quality of his relationship with the bar and with the drinking that happens there. But this explanation, accurate as it is, doesn't fully account for what Moe's provides. What Moe's provides, beyond the alcohol, is a particular kind of uncritical presence. Moe doesn't evaluate Homer. He doesn't require Homer to be other than he is. He doesn't maintain high standards of conversation or behavior or hygiene. He provides a space where Homer can exist without the specific pressures of being a husband and a father and an employee, without the responsibilities and the performance demands that those roles involve. At Moe's, Homer is not required to be good at anything. He's just required to be present and to consume. This is the specific emotional service that bars have always provided for certain people in certain conditions, and the show understands this service without romanticizing it. Moe's is a refuge that provides relief at a cost. The relief is real. The cost, in terms of what the time spent there removes from Homer's family life and his own well-being, is also real. The show holds both of these truths simultaneously without resolving them into a moral. Moe himself is a character who has become considerably more interesting across the show's run than his original conception as a simple bartender archetype. The show has developed his backstory across various episodes, revealing a character of considerable depth and considerable pain. He had dreams that didn't materialize. He has had relationships that failed. He is, by various implications across the run, deeply lonely in a way that his position as the proprietor of a gathering place only partially mitigates. He is surrounded by people who come to his bar but who are not his friends in any deep sense, who pass through his space and consume his product and carry their real lives elsewhere. Moe's love episodes are the most overtly emotional treatment of this loneliness. The episodes in which he falls for someone, which happen with a regularity that suggests the writers are genuinely interested in this aspect of the character, handle the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being someone whose emotional availability far exceeds the opportunities available to them. Moe wants connection. He wants the kind of relationship that would give his life a different center than the bar. And the bar, which exists because of the absence of that relationship, makes it progressively harder to achieve. The bar is both his solution to loneliness and the thing that perpetuates it. This closed loop, the specific trap of an adaptive strategy that prevents the thing it was designed to address, is the most honest piece of character psychology the show has produced for any character outside the Simpson family. Krusty Studios, where Krusty the Clown broadcasts his show, is a location that functions as the show's most sustained depiction of show business mythology. Krusty's career, his relationship with his craft, the specific quality of his professional life, is one of the show's most interesting ongoing portraits of what entertainment actually looks like from the inside. Krusty is, by the standards of Springfield's universe, a success. He is famous, recognizable, a beloved figure in the community. His show has been on the air for decades. Children adore him. His image is commercially exploited on products across the consumer spectrum. By any external measure, Krusty the Clown has achieved what he set out to achieve. But the interior of Krusty's professional life, glimpsed across multiple episodes, has a quality of desolation that the exterior success doesn't hint at. He performs a version of joy that he has long since stopped feeling. he maintains a persona that has become increasingly alien to whoever he actually is. He is held in affection by an audience that loves Krusty the Clown rather than Herschel Schmoikel Krustovsky, the rabbi's son from Springfield who chose this particular form of escape from his own life. The show's most honest treatment of Krusty involves his relationship with his father, Rabbi Hyman Krustovsky. The estrangement between them, dramatized in Like Father, Like Clown and revisited in subsequent episodes, is about the specific failure mode that comes from a child choosing a life that the parent cannot recognize as legitimate. The rabbi's grief over his son's career is not simply disapproval. It's the grief of a man who cannot find his child in the person his child has become. The clown persona is not transparent to the father. It conceals rather than reveals. And the concealment, which was its original function, preventing the child from being seen as what he started from, has become the obstacle to being seen at all. The resolution of their estrangement is emotionally satisfying within the episode's frame, but the show is honest enough about the complexity of this kind of reconciliation to leave some of its weight unresolved. A relationship damaged across decades cannot be fully repaired in a single encounter, however emotionally charged. And Krusty's continued performance of a persona that conceals rather than reveals suggests that the reconciliation, real as it is, hasn't changed the fundamental dynamic. He is still hidden inside the makeup. He is still Krusty rather than Herschel. The father and son found each other in the episode. The fundamental condition that separated them persists. Number. The show's relationship with time outside the floating timeline. We have discussed the floating timeline as a structural feature of The Simpsons and as a subject of theoretical investigation. But the show's relationship with time operates at another level that deserves attention. The Simpsons is a show that is deeply interested in the past, not in the specific historical past that it references for satirical purposes, though those are present throughout the run. In the personal past, in the way that the characters' histories shape their present experience in ways that are not always visible to them or to the people around them. The flashback episode is one of the show's recurring formats, and the best of them are distinguished by the seriousness with which they engage with the question of how people become who they are. The Mona Simpson episodes, which trace Homer's relationship with his absent mother from her departure through her death, are the most sustained example. But the format recurs across the show's catalog with a consistency that reveals it as a genuine creative preoccupation rather than an occasional conceit. What the flashback episodes do, at their most effective, is create a conversation between the character as we know them and the circumstances that produce that character. They allow the show to demonstrate, without being schematic about it, that people are not self-originating, that the specific shape of any given person's dysfunction, their particular pattern of need and avoidance and coping strategy, has an origin that is not simply character, not simply will or choice or nature, but history, the specific things that happen to specific people at specific times. Homer's history is the most extensively explored, but even characters who receive less sustained narrative attention have histories that the show has occasionally glimpsed and that, once glimpsed, reframe everything. The brief but significant look at Ned Flanders' childhood in the mental hospital episode transforms the character not by adding new information, but by providing a causal frame for what was already there. Once you know about the behavioral conditioning, Ned's niceness means something different. Not better or worse, just different. The difference between a trait and an adaptation, between character and scar tissue. The show's interest in personal history coexists paradoxically with its structural commitment to the floating timeline's suppression of history. The characters don't age, their backstories get revised to match the moving present. The events that should have permanent consequences are reset by the next episode, and yet the show keeps returning to the question of how people's pasts shape their presents, keeps finding new angles on the histories of characters who are simultaneously frozen in an eternal present and made by their accumulated past. This paradox is one of the things that makes The Simpsons feel dense and complex, even in episodes that are superficially simple. The characters are carrying history that the show's structure doesn't allow them to age through, and the tension between the weight they carry and the eternal present they inhabit is part of what gives the best episodes their specific gravity. Homer is simultaneously always in his late 30s and carrying 36 years of not aging. The weight of the not aging is real. The denial of the aging is the fiction. and the fiction coexisting with the weight produces the show's specific emotional texture, the feeling that these are people who are getting away with something that will eventually catch up with them if time were ever allowed to pass. Time is the great suppressed subject of The Simpsons. The show is about time in the same way that it's about radiation, which is to say that it's about something it cannot fully acknowledge, that it approaches through allegory and through accumulated detail rather than through direct confrontation. Springfield is frozen because acknowledging that time has passed would require acknowledging what time does. That people age, that children leave, that parents become old, that the specific configuration of any family at any given moment is temporary in a way that cannot be reversed or preserved, only carried in memory as the present reconfigures itself around what's no longer there. Time's passage is the truth that Springfield's eternal present is designed to evade, and the evasion is the show's central creative gesture, the thing that makes Springfield what it is, rather than what any real town could be. In a real town, Bart would be 50. In a real family, the children would have grown up and gone. In a real life, Homer would be old and Marge would be old and the house would be quieter and the table set for fewer people. The floating timeline refuses this reality, not because it's a cartoon and cartoons don't age, but because some version of this particular family, in this particular house, in this particular impossible town, is what the show has committed to giving its audience forever. And the audience accepts this. The audience has more than accepted it. The audience has made it a condition of engagement, has formed an attachment to the eternal present so complete that the show's attempts to imagine its characters aging, in flash-forward episodes and in alternate reality stories, are experienced as departures from the real rather than glimpses of what the real could be. Springfield is frozen because we need it to be. The show understood this before it became explicit, and the floating timeline is the institutional expression of that understanding. It's not a production convenience dressed up as mythology. It's a genuine creative act of service to an audience that has found in this particular family's persistence something that no other piece of entertainment provides in the same form. They're still there. They will always still be there. And in a world where everything changes, everything ends, everyone you love eventually leaves or is left, the couch on Evergreen Terrace and the family assembled on it is one of the permanent things. That's Springfield. That's the whole iceberg. That's what you're really watching when you watch The Simpsons. And it's enough. It has always been enough. If you watch this all the way through, or if you fell asleep somewhere in the middle and this is still playing, drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. We're always curious. Subscribe if you want more. And thank you for spending time in Springfield. Sleep well. Number, deeper dive. The evolution of Homer's character across all 36 seasons. Homer Simpson is the most analyzed character in American animated television, and the analysis is justified by what the character actually provides to analyze. He is not a simple figure. He never was. Even in the earliest episodes, when his basic comedic role as the bumbling but loving father was being established, there were elements of his characterization that exceeded the requirements of that role and pointed towards something more complicated. The Homer of the first season is recognizably the Homer of the later seasons, but he is also distinctly different from him, and the difference is worth examining carefully because it reveals something about what the show understood about this character and what it decided to do with that understanding. First season Homer is someone whose intelligence, while limited, is not as comprehensively defeated as it will become. He makes mistakes, but they are the mistakes of someone who is trying and failing rather than someone who has given up trying and has found a way to be more or less comfortable with that. He argues with Marge in ways that suggest real communication, frustrating and incomplete, but real. He disciplines his children with a quality of intention that the later seasons largely evacuate. He thinks about his job in a way that includes some awareness of what it is and what it means, rather than the near-total dissociation from professional reality that characterizes his later relationship with the power plant. This earlier Homer is not less funny than the later one. In many ways, he's funnier, because the comedy emerges from the gap between his intentions and his results, rather than from the absence of intention entirely. When Homer tries and fails in the early episodes, the failure has a quality of genuine disappointment that makes the comedy richer, more textured, more fully human. When Homer fails in the later seasons, the failure is a function of his fundamental incapacity rather than of the gap between capacity and aspiration. And the comedy is correspondingly broader and less resonant. The change happened gradually and was driven by multiple factors. The discovery that Homer's stupidity was a renewable comedy resource, capable of generating laughs at a volume that more grounded characterization couldn't match. The pressure to deliver consistent broad comedy across 22 episodes per season, which pushed the room toward the dependable over the ambitious, and possibly, as some production observers have suggested, the natural drift that happens in long-running character-driven comedy, where the character's distinctive traits become progressively more exaggerated because each season's writers are responding to the previous season's version rather than to the original. The exaggeration compounds. Homer becomes stupider each season not because any single creative decision made him stupider, but because each room of writers was working from a Homer who was already slightly stupider than the original, and their natural tendency toward exaggerating for effect meant they pushed him slightly further. 36 seasons of this process produces a very long distance from the starting point. The question of whether this drift represents a loss or an evolution is one of the most sustained debates in the fan community, and it resists easy resolution because both sides have real evidence. The early Homer is more humanly complex. The later Homer, at his best, achieves a kind of cosmic absurdity, a complete liberation from realistic causality that produces its own category of comedy. Both are genuine artistic achievements. They just achieve different things. What can be said with confidence is that the drift created a split between the Homer who exists as a cultural figure, the Homer who shows up in memes and in casual references and in the broad cultural perception of the show, and the Homer who exists in the show's actual text. The cultural Homer is almost entirely the later version, the pure id, the man who operates entirely on immediate desire without cognitive mediation. The textual Homer is more varied, containing seasons of real characterization alongside seasons of near-total cartoon simplicity. The Homer who makes the show's most emotionally powerful episodes possible is not the cartoon Homer. He's the version from the seasons where the writers maintained enough of the original characterization to give Homer's love for his family genuine weight. Homer's love for Marge, which the show depicts across its run with varying degrees of conviction, is most moving in the episodes where Homer's intelligence and awareness are sufficient for him to understand what he has and what he risks losing. When Homer is pure cartoon, his love becomes a running gag. When Homer is complex, his love becomes the show's central emotional statement. The episode And Maggie Makes Three, which depicts Homer's response to discovering that Marge is pregnant with a third child when he has just achieved his lifelong dream of quitting the power plant, is perhaps the definitive statement of what Homer can be when the show takes him seriously. The episode requires Homer to make a real sacrifice, to return to the job he hated to provide for a family he loves, and to experience this sacrifice as both genuinely costly and genuinely worth making. The ending, in which Homer reveals that the photograph of Maggie he keeps at work covers the motivational plaque that Burns has hung in every workstation. Don't forget, you're here forever. So that what he actually sees when he looks up is a mosaic of Maggie photos surrounding the words, "Do it for her," is one of the most genuinely moving moments the show has produced. This moment works because the Homer who makes that choice is complex enough to have made it meaningfully. He understands what he's giving up and he chooses to give it up anyway, not through stupidity, not through inability to perceive the cost, but through love that is clear-eyed about its own conditions. This is the Homer who can make the audience feel something real, and he's the Homer who becomes progressively rarer as the show continues. But he never disappears entirely. Across 36 seasons, through all the drift and the exaggeration and the cartoon simplification, there are episodes that retrieve him, moments that remind you what this character can do when the show is being honest about him. These retrievals become less frequent over time, but they continue to occur. And they continue to demonstrate that the emotional core of Homer's character, the desperate love that drives him and the fear of loss that shadows it, is still accessible even after decades of being buried under accumulated buffoonery. Number. The music of Springfield. What the show's score reveals about its emotional truth. The music of The Simpsons is among the most overlooked elements of the show's achievement, and overlooking it means missing one of the most sustained artistic accomplishments in American television history. Alf Clausen served as the show's primary composer from the second season through season 28, when he was replaced in a move that the fan community received with considerable dismay. In the years of his tenure, Clausen composed an extraordinary volume of original music for the show, music that served not just as background incidental scoring, but as an active emotional participant in the show's storytelling. Clausen's score is remarkable for several qualities that distinguish it from the approach most animated shows take to their music. Where many animated shows use a relatively limited palette of recurring musical ideas, returning to the same cues for similar dramatic situations across episodes, Clausen composed original music specifically for individual scenes and episodes to a degree that was genuinely unusual in television animation. This means that the music of The Simpsons is enormously varied in its specific content, while maintaining a recognizable voice across its enormous breadth. The recognizable voice is itself worth examining. Clausen's scoring for the show developed, across his many years of work with it, a specific harmonic language, a specific orchestrational palette, a specific set of musical gestures that are immediately identifiable as belonging to Springfield, even when the specific melodic content is new. This language was developed in relation to the characters and situations of the show, shaped by sustained engagement with what the stories needed from the music. What the music tends to do most effectively is operate in a register slightly lower than the comedy, providing an emotional undertone that the comedy works against. The show's best episodes are emotionally complex in the specific way that comedy can be complex, simultaneously funny and sad, simultaneously absurd and moving. The music supports the sad and moving, while the visual and verbal comedy operates in the register of the funny and absurd. The combination produces the show's characteristic double-register experience, the way the best episodes make you laugh and feel something real simultaneously, without either response canceling the other. The most frequently discussed musical moment in the show's history is the use of Beethoven's Ode to Joy in an episode dealing with Mr. Burns's childhood, and the discussion is justified by how precisely the choice works. The music's cultural weight, its associations with joy in its most sincere and most humanist form, positioned against the visual reality of what Burns is and what his life has become, creates a specific kind of irony that goes deeper than simple contrast. It's the irony of something being present in its original beauty at the moment, when the consequences of its absence are most visible. The joy the music expresses is the joy that the life depicted in the scene has failed to contain, and the music and the scene together produce something neither could alone. This is music doing what only music can do in combination with visual storytelling, not illustrating the emotion but complicating it, adding a dimension that the visual and verbal elements cannot provide on their own. Clausen understood this capacity and used it throughout his tenure with a sophistication that the show's critics rarely credit. The original theme, composed by Danny Elfman, is perhaps the most famous piece of television music ever written and the most thoroughly analyzed. Its specific qualities have been discussed in contexts ranging from academic musicology to casual fan observation, and what emerges from the best of these discussions is a consistent observation. The theme does something unusual for television comedy music, which is that it contains genuine melancholy alongside its energy and propulsiveness. It is not unambiguously cheerful. It has a wistful quality, a longing quality, that coexists with the triumphant brass and the whirling woodwinds. This emotional complexity in the theme prepares the viewer, at the level of musical perception, for the emotional complexity that is the show's actual register. You're signaled, before a frame of story has been shown, that this show will be more than one thing at once, that the comedy will have something underneath it and the warmth will have something alongside it. The theme tells you, pay attention to what the music is doing. There is more here than there appears to be. This has been true across 36 seasons. The music of The Simpsons has always been doing more than it appears to be doing, always contributing a layer of meaning that operates at the level of felt experience rather than conscious analysis, always participating in the show's emotional storytelling in ways that most viewers absorb without registering as musical. That invisibility is, paradoxically, the mark of the music's success. When film and television scoring is working at its best, the audience doesn't notice it as scoring. They just feel what the scene is making them feel, without being aware that some significant proportion of that feeling is being generated by the orchestra. The music of Springfield is in you. You have been hearing it across however many episodes of The Simpsons you have watched, and it has been shaping your emotional experience of those episodes in ways you haven't been consciously tracking. Every time you felt something watching the show that surprised you with its depth, some portion of that depth was musical. Some portion of what made the moment more than just a cartoon was the specific harmonic choice, the specific orchestrational texture, the specific melodic fragment that arrived at that moment and told you that what you were watching mattered. That's one of the things that makes The Simpsons extraordinary. It takes all of its art seriously. The animation, the writing, the performance, the music, each of these is doing real work, sophisticated work, work that earns its place in the total experience. And the total experience, accumulated across hundreds of episodes and 36 years of continuous presence in American cultural life, is something that none of its individual components fully explains. The show is more than the sum of its parts. It always has been. That's the first thing about it. And in some ways the last, and everything in between, all the theories and all the production history and all the accumulated mythology, is an attempt to account for that surplus. For the thing that is there beyond what can be fully enumerated. Springfield is that thing, the couch is that thing, the family is that thing. And you have been watching it your whole life. Number, The Simpsons and the American Family. 36 years of portrait. The claim that The Simpsons is the definitive portrait of the American family is easy to make and easy to dismiss. Easy to make because the show has occupied that symbolic position in American culture for so long that it has become the conventional description. Easy to dismiss because any claim about what the American family is and what represents it authentically is immediately contestable on grounds of which American family, whose experience, whose defining qualities. But the claim is worth taking seriously in a specific, limited sense. Not the claim that The Simpsons is the true or representative portrait of all American families. The claim that The Simpsons has identified and depicted with unusual accuracy a specific emotional structure that cuts across many of the obvious differences between American families and that constitutes something genuinely common to the experience of family life in America across the show's run. That emotional structure is something like, we are trying. We are trying against conditions that make trying difficult. We are held together by something that doesn't fully express itself in words or in the conventional gestures of family harmony, something more like gravity than like feeling, something that keeps us in each other's orbit even when specific episodes of shared life are actively miserable. We are doing our best with what we have and what we are. Our best is often not good enough, but it is what we have to offer, and we offer it again and again, because the family is what we have and what we are, and we are not giving it up. This is not a portrait of the happy American family. It's a portrait of the persistent American family. The family that stays together not through ease or comfort or natural compatibility, but through choice, through habit, through the accumulated weight of shared experience and shared meaning, through love that has survived enough damage to know itself as durable. Homer and Marge have had their marriage tested across 36 seasons, in ways that any realistic marriage would not survive. The show has brought them to the edge of dissolution more times than can be counted. And yet they're together. They're still on the couch. The marriage persists. And the persistence is not naive or delusional or a failure to perceive how bad things have been. It's a positive choice, renewed continuously, to remain committed to something that costs a great deal and gives a great deal and is, taken whole, worth the cost. That's the American family the show depicts. Not the idealized family of advertising and political speech. The actual family, the one that is messy and imperfect and sometimes awful and deeply, durably, indestructibly loving. The family that you can't fully explain to anyone who hasn't experienced something like it, because the specific combination of exasperation and tenderness, and history, and future and daily domestic reality that constitutes a family is not something that can be represented from the outside. It has to be known from the inside. The Simpsons gives you the inside. That's the gift. That's what has made it endure for 36 years across every change in American cultural life, across every shift in what American families look like and what they face. The specific cultural context changes. The emotional structure it depicts does not. And the emotional structure, that specific combination of persistence and imperfection and durable love, is what every family watching recognizes, at some level, as themselves. That recognition is the show's real achievement. Not the comedy, which is extraordinary. Not the satire, which is pointed and intelligent and occasionally brilliant. The recognition. The specific experience of watching people on a screen navigate their family life and feeling, somewhere below the level of conscious response, that this is what it's like. This is what it actually feels like to love people and be exasperated by them and need them and sometimes fail them and keep coming back anyway. That's what Springfield is. That's what it has always been. And that's why we keep going back to it, in early morning quiet and in late night dark and in all the hours between, year after year, season after season, episode after episode. Because home is where we keep going back to. Even when home is a fictional place in a contaminated valley somewhere on an uncertain map. Even when the people there are yellow and four-fingered and impossibly ageless. Even when the town's founding was a lie and the water is probably poisoned and the billionaire is over 100 years old and the baby may or may not have shot someone. Home is where the couch is, where the family is, where the television is on and the picture is the same and the story continues. One more episode, one more season, one more year. That's enough. That has always been enough. Number. The complete case for each major theory. A systematic review. The fan theories that surround The Simpsons are not all created equal. Some are supported by a handful of interesting details that could sustain the theory if nothing else existed in the text to complicate it. Others are supported by a body of evidence so large and so specific that dismissing them requires actively choosing not to follow the evidence where it leads. And a few exist in a category that is harder to name. Theories where the evidence is compelling, but the conclusion the evidence leads to is so uncomfortable, or so strange, or so resistant to the kind of certainty that would make a theory satisfying, that engaging with them fully requires a tolerance for ambiguity that most people aren't looking for from a cartoon. Let's go through each of the major theories with the seriousness they deserve. The radiation theory, which proposes that the Springfield nuclear power plant has been causing measurable biological and cognitive damage to the town's population across the show's entire run, is the theory with the most extensive canonical support. The evidence for it is not speculative. It is in the show's text, stated or depicted in episodes across multiple decades of the run. The plant has 342 documented safety violations, a number established in a specific episode and never revised downward. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million, which Burns declined to spend. The violations include radioactive waste being dumped into public waterways and onto children's playgrounds. The facility's safety inspector has an IQ of 55. A three-eyed fish was pulled from the river near the plant and became national news within the show's universe. Burns undergoes weekly radiation treatments that cause his body to emit a visible green glow. Treatments that keep him alive for precisely one more week, without which he dies. The population of Springfield displays physical characteristics that the show's art style consistently attributes to Springfield residents and not to outsiders. Yellow skin, 4 fingers on each hand, bulging eyes, physical features that, within the show's visual grammar, distinguish Springfield residents from people who come from outside the town. The show draws visitors with slightly more realistic proportions than it draws Springfield residents, creating a visible, observable distinction between the contaminated population and the uncontaminated one. The theory's most compelling element is not any single piece of evidence but the cumulative pattern the evidence creates. Each individual detail could be dismissed as isolated satire, as comic exaggeration, as the kind of absurdist detail that animated comedy uses without intending larger implications. But the details don't remain isolated. They connect. They form a consistent picture, developed across 36 seasons, of a town whose population has been systematically harmed by the facility at its center, and whose inability to recognize and resist this harm is itself a symptom of the harm. The coma theory has a different relationship with canonical evidence. It is supported less by specific factual details in the show and more by the structural pattern of the show's storytelling across its run. The coma itself is canonical. Homer entered a coma in a Season 4 episode. The show established within that episode that the coma caused permanent brain damage. The episode concluded with Homer apparently waking up and everything returning to normal. The theory proposes that the apparent waking was itself part of the dream, that Homer did not actually wake up, and that every episode since that date has taken place inside the dreaming mind of an unconscious man. The supporting evidence is the tonal shift that occurs in the show's storytelling after that point, the transition from grounded domestic realism to increasingly surreal and consequence-free fantasy. The aging problem. which the theory resolves more elegantly than any other framework by explaining that Homer's dreaming mind cannot imagine his children aging because he wasn't conscious to witness their aging. The escalating unreality of each subsequent season, which corresponds to a dreaming mind whose connection to external stimulus grows progressively more attenuated. The theory has been engaged with, acknowledged, and denied by the show's creators. The denial came wrapped inside an episode that explicitly depicted Homer waking from a long coma, which the show then identified as a planted fake scene. This denial, which acknowledges the theory while claiming it's wrong, is exactly the kind of response that the theory predicts. A story about a man who is dreaming would naturally incorporate the dream's own denial of its dream status. Whether you find the coma theory convincing depends partly on how you evaluate the tonal shift evidence. If the shift from grounded to surreal storytelling would have happened anyway as the show's production environment changed and its writers rotated, the theory loses much of its support. If the shift is best explained as the progressive deterioration of a dreaming mind, the theory gains substantial credibility. The honest answer is that the available evidence doesn't fully resolve this question. The founding myth theory, which examines the episode Lisa the Iconoclast and extends its implications to the town's entire history, is supported by both the specific canonical content of that episode and by the cumulative pattern of Springfield's relationship with its own history across the show's run. The town's collective amnesia about catastrophic events, the episodic reset that makes major disasters disappear between episodes, the legal decree in the Skinner imposter episode that makes it criminal to acknowledge the truth of a specific situation, all of these constitute a pattern of systematic truth suppression that the founding myth theory reads as foundational rather than incidental. The Mona Simpson conspiracy theory, which traces the connections between Homer's cognitive damage, Burns's long-term persecution of Homer's mother, the deal between Burns and Grandpa Simpson that guaranteed Homer's employment, and the biological weapons facility that Burns operated in Springfield, is supported by an extensive body of canonical evidence that the show established across multiple seasons and never fully synthesized into a single explicit narrative. The individual elements are all canonical. The connection between them is the theory's contribution, and it's a connection that the evidence strongly supports. What all of the major theories share, and what distinguishes them collectively from simply reading too much into a cartoon, is that they are not reading things into the text that aren't there. They are reading things out of the text that are there. Every piece of evidence the theories rely on is canonical. Every connection they draw between canonical elements is supportable by the text. The conclusions they reach are not ones the show endorses explicitly, but they are conclusions to which the show's own text leads if you follow it carefully. That's the nature of the iceberg. The show put the material down there. The theories are the attempts to account for what the material, taken seriously and followed where it leads, actually says. Number. What The Simpsons Knows About American Mythology. There is a specific argument that The Simpsons has been making for 36 years about America, and it's an argument that the show has always been making not through polemic, but through the accumulated weight of depicted experience. The argument is about the relationship between American mythology and American reality, between the stories America tells about itself and the conditions that those stories are constructed to obscure. The show was created in the late 1980s and premiered at the beginning of a decade that would prove unusually fertile ground for its specific form of satire. The America of 1989 was an America in the late stages of a particular ideological configuration, a configuration built on certain foundational stories about individual achievement, middle-class prosperity, and the natural justice of economic outcomes. These stories were being told with unusual intensity during this period, and the gap between the stories and the experience of most American families was becoming unusually visible. Homer Simpson is the emblem of that gap. He is the American worker of mythology, the middle-class family man whose labor is rewarded with a decent house and a secure life and the capacity to support a family without overwhelming anxiety. He has those things. The house exists. The family is housed and fed and clothed. By the metrics of the mythology, Homer has succeeded. But what his success looks like from the inside, what it costs and what it provides and what its conditions are, is something the mythology doesn't account for and the show depicts without sentimentality. The success is real, and it's maintained through a kind of heroic incompetence that the mythology can't acknowledge. because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the conditions of success for ordinary American workers are not the conditions of fairness or of merit, but of contingency and of luck and of the specific protections, some of them corrupt, that keep the failures from being permanent. Homer keeps his job because Grandpa made a deal. The deal was made from a position of weakness. The deal has been honored not through any mechanism of justice, but through the specific corruption of a billionaire who found the deal convenient. Homer's success is a product of exploitation and complicity, and the specific dysfunction of a system in which the most powerful figure in Springfield retains the least competent safety inspector in the nuclear industry, because a competent one would shut the plant down. This is not a story the American mythology of the 1980s was telling about itself. It's the story that the show has been telling about that mythology for 36 years. And the show has told it through comedy, through the specific alchemy of making something that reveals a terrible truth in a way that makes you laugh rather than despair. Because the truth, stated plainly, would be unbearable, while the truth told through Homer falling off a cliff and walking away while the music swells is something you can carry with you and think about later, in quieter moments, when the comedy has done its work of making the truth accessible. The Simpsons knows what America is. It has always known. It has been showing you, in the specific way that fiction can show you things that direct statement cannot, for the entirety of its run. And the audience, across 36 years, has been watching, taking it in, laughing, feeling something underneath the laughter that is not exactly comfortable but is exactly true. That's what it is. That's the whole iceberg. That's Springfield. And somewhere out there right now, someone is watching it. In the dark, in the quiet, in whatever small hours of whatever morning, the television is on and the show is running and the Simpsons are going about their impossible, eternal, beautiful, damaged life. And the world is somehow slightly better for it. Number, closing thoughts. The value of staying in Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have covered the surface and the middle depths and the far lower levels. We have examined the production history and the character psychology and the impossible geography and the founding myths and the musical layers and the theories that account for why everything in Springfield is impossible and why the impossibility is the point. We have sat with the grief at the bottom of the iceberg and the love at the bottom of the grief and the family at the bottom of the love. What is there to say at the end of this when the exploration has gone as far as it's going to go in a single video? Only this: The Simpsons is worth taking seriously. Not because it's a masterpiece of unified artistic vision. It isn't. 36 seasons of television production is too vast and too various and too compromised by its own commercial existence to be a masterpiece in that sense. But because it has been present for so long, in so many people's lives, at so many moments of joy and grief and boredom and wonder, that it has become something that is more than a television show. It has become a part of the texture of experience for anyone who grew up with it, a part of the vocabulary through which those people understand family and failure and love and the specific absurdity of trying to live a decent life in conditions that make decency difficult. A part of the archive of feeling that makes empathy possible across the considerable differences in circumstance that separate individual human lives. That's what great popular art does. Not the art of isolated genius, not the art that requires preparation and cultivation to appreciate, but the art that meets you where you are and gives you something you didn't know you needed until it arrived. The Simpsons has been doing this, in its best moments, for 36 years. Its worst moments don't erase the best. Its commercial compromises don't negate its genuine achievement. Its continuity errors don't undermine its emotional truth. Springfield is broken, and Springfield is beautiful. The family is damaged, and the family is loved. The town is poisoned, and the town persists. The theories are true, and the theories don't resolve anything. The show doesn't age, and neither does the need for it. Number, the complete catalog of Springfield's impossible moments. Across 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, The Simpsons has accumulated a body of impossible moments that the show depicts without explanation and that the characters experience without apparent surprise. These moments are not the show's supernatural or science fiction episodes, the treehouse of horrors and the body swap comedies and the time travel stories that the show explicitly marks as exceptional. They are moments embedded in ordinary episodes, in stories that otherwise operate in the register of recognizable domestic and social comedy, that simply contain something that cannot happen, Cataloging them comprehensively would require more space than exists here, but examining a selection of the most striking examples reveals patterns that, taken together, constitute a picture of Springfield's relationship with the possible that is stranger and more consistent than the conventional explanation of animation's freedom from realistic constraint would suggest. Homer's body has been the site of the most extreme impossible moments across the show's run. His capacity for physical damage is well documented. He has been struck by cars on multiple occasions and recovered without lasting injury. He has fallen from significant heights and walked away. He has been electrocuted, burned, poisoned, and subjected to physical trauma that, in realistic terms, would be permanently debilitating or fatal. And he has recovered from all of it, episode after episode, without any permanent physical consequence. This superhuman resilience is so extreme and so consistent that it has generated its own body of fan theorizing. The radiation theory addresses it directly. If Springfield's contaminated environment has fundamentally altered the biology of its residents through decades of exposure to nuclear material, it's plausible within the show's own logic that some residents would develop a degree of biological resilience that exceeds the normal human range. Homer's body, under this reading, is the adaptive response of an organism that has been subjected to extraordinary physical stressors from a very early age. The coma theory offers a different explanation. If Homer is dreaming, his body cannot die in any meaningful sense because his body is in a hospital bed, and the Homer, who is falling off cliffs and being hit by cars, is not his physical body but the dreaming version of himself that his unconscious mind has constructed. The dreaming Homer can survive anything because survival is the necessary condition for the dream to continue. The dream ends only when Homer's actual body gives out, and that event would constitute the show's end rather than the end of any particular episode. Beyond Homer's physical resilience, the show's impossible moments cluster around a few specific categories. Events that should have permanent consequences for Springfield's social and physical reality but that are entirely absent from subsequent episodes. Encounters with the supernatural that are depicted with full seriousness in their episodes but that are never referenced again as though they occurred. And moments of character insight or development that the show depicts with genuine emotional conviction and then never builds upon, as though the insight occurred outside the timeline rather than within it. The dome episode from the Simpsons movie is the most dramatic example of the first category. The United States government sealed Springfield under a glass dome. This is not a small event. This is the complete physical isolation of a populated town by federal action, an event of enormous historical and political significance that would, in any realistic continuation, define everything about Springfield's subsequent existence. The movie ends with the dome removed and Springfield restored, but the event's absence from subsequent episodes is not explained. The dome simply did not happen. In the continuity that follows the movie, or if it happened, it has been absorbed into the category of Springfield events that the town has collectively agreed not to remember. This absorption is the key. The show has established explicitly through the Skinner imposter episode's legal decree and through the general pattern of catastrophic events being forgotten between episodes that Springfield's relationship with its own history is selective and manageable. The town chooses what to remember. It chooses, collectively and without discussion, what events count for ongoing reality and what events can be retired into the void of official non-memory. The dome happened. The dome's consequences were decided by consensus to be non-binding, and so the dome is forgotten. This collective memory management, once you've seen the Skinner episode make it explicit, is retroactively visible in every previous instance of Springfield forgetting what should have changed it. The town didn't forget the dome due to narrative convenience. The town forgot the dome the same way it forgets everything that would require it to acknowledge the full dimensions of its situation, by choosing to, by the specific social mechanism of agreed suppression that is Springfield's most distinctive feature and its most essential survival strategy. The supernatural encounters are a different kind of impossibility. The show has depicted, in regular non-treehouse episodes, events that are unambiguously supernatural and that the characters experience as real. Homer's multiple conversations with God. The encounters with various supernatural figures across the show's run. The psychic who appears in a Season 1 episode and who demonstrates genuine precognitive abilities that the episode does not walk back or explain away. These events are depicted as real within the episode containing them, and then they are never referenced again. as though the supernatural capacity of Springfield's universe is not a stable feature of that universe but a contextual one, present in episodes that need it and absent from those that don't. The character development moments present the subtlest form of impossibility. The show depicts, with genuine conviction and real emotional weight, moments in which characters arrive at specific insights about themselves and their situations. Homer understands, with unusual clarity, what he has been doing wrong and what he needs to do differently. Bart connects, briefly and completely, with the consequences of his actions for someone he has harmed. Marge acknowledges, for a moment of genuine vulnerability, the cost of the role she has been performing. These moments of insight are real, within the episode they occur in. And then, in the next episode, the insight is gone, as thoroughly as though it had never happened, the character back in their default configuration, the understanding retrieved into the void of Springfield's collective amnesia. These impossible character development moments are perhaps the ones that are hardest to dismiss as simple episodic storytelling convention, because they're the ones that feel most like a genuine loss. The insight was real. The change it implied would have been valuable, and it's gone. Not because the character rejected it, but because the show's structure doesn't accommodate accumulation of this kind. Each episode starts fresh. The character is always starting from the same point. Unless they're not. The coma theory proposes that the reset is Homer's dreaming mind returning to its reference state between dream cycles. The radiation theory proposes that the cognitive damage caused by contamination prevents the integration of new understanding into lasting behavioral change. The collective denial theory proposes that the reset is not internal to the character but external. That Springfield's social environment actively works against the integration of inconvenient truths, including truths about oneself, and that the reset is a product of that environment rather than of individual psychology. Any of these explanations would account for the phenomenon. The honest assessment is that the phenomenon itself, the reset, the consistent failure of insight to produce lasting change, is real, and is one of the show's most precise observations about the human condition in a specific kind of social environment. The theories are the attempts to explain why it's so consistent, why it operates without exception, why Springfield cannot change even in the moments when its residents seem to understand that they need to. Number, the mystery of Springfield's economy. Springfield's economic reality is one of the show's most carefully maintained mysteries, in the sense that the show has spent 36 seasons providing information about it that never quite adds up to a consistent picture. The power plant is the town's largest employer and, by implication, its primary economic engine. Burns is its owner and its sole beneficiary in any meaningful financial sense. The plant provides electricity to the entire town and employs a significant portion of its working population. This creates an economic dependency of remarkable completeness. Springfield is a company town, in the specific historical sense, a community whose economic existence depends on the continued operation of a single enterprise controlled by a single individual. The company town in American history is not a comfortable subject. The company towns of the industrial age were environments of specifically engineered dependency, places where workers were not just employed by the same company but housed in company housing, supplied by company stores, educated in company schools, and subjected to a web of economic relationships that left them structurally incapable of independent action. The dependency was the point. It kept the labor force in place, docile and unable to resist the conditions imposed on them. Springfield is a company town with a nuclear power plant instead of a coal mine, and with an employer who has been running it for long enough to forget that there was ever anything before him. Burns's ownership of Springfield's economy is so complete that it's invisible, the way things that have always been a certain way become invisible, the way you stop seeing a building you walk past every day. Springfield's residents don't perceive themselves as living in a company town because the company has always been there, the dependency has always existed, and the alternative of an economy not organized around Burns's power plant is not something they have any framework for imagining. The other businesses of Springfield, Moe's Tavern, Krusty Burger, the Quick E-Mart, form a secondary economy that exists in relationship to the primary one. They serve the people whose economic existence depends on the plant. Their viability is contingent on the plant's continued operation. If Burns were to close the plant tomorrow, or if the plant were shut down by the federal government for its nearly innumerable safety violations, Springfield's secondary economy would collapse within months. This creates the specific trap that the show has been depicting for 36 years. Springfield cannot challenge Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. The economic dependency that Burns has engineered over a century of monopolistic control has created the conditions under which challenging him becomes economically suicidal. And the population that might otherwise mount such a challenge is, as the radiation theory suggests, cognitively compromised by the very facility that creates the economic dependency. The trap is perfect. The population is dependent on the plant for economic survival. The plant is damaging the population's capacity for the kind of collective reasoning that might lead to organized challenge. The damage makes the dependency more complete. The dependency makes the damage more acceptable. Burns doesn't need to actively prevent resistance. The system he has built prevents it automatically, self-sustaining and self-reinforcing, a closed loop that runs without active maintenance. This is the show's economic argument, made through the accumulated detail of 36 years of storytelling rather than through any single explicit statement. Springfield's economic reality is not a background condition. It is the fundamental constraint within which all of Springfield's other realities operate. And Burns, who is old enough to have designed this constraint deliberately and patient enough to have maintained it across a century, is the architect of every aspect of Springfield's impossible situation. The residents of Springfield go to work at the plant and bring home paychecks that return to Burns in the form of rent, utility bills, consumer spending at businesses that exist because of the plant, and the compound economic relationships that constitute a functioning company town's closed circuit. The money circles, the dependency circulates, and Burns sits at the center of the circulation, unchanged, eternal, sustained by his weekly treatments and his accumulated wealth and the population's inability to perceive the architecture of their own captivity. This is what Homer drives to every morning. This is what Marge's household budget is organized around. This is the economic substrate of every family dinner and every birthday party and every moment of daily life at 742 Evergreen Terrace. The invisible but total economic reality of Springfield, the company town that doesn't know it's a company town. Number the question. The show never answers. After everything, after 36 seasons and hundreds of hours, and all of the mythology and production history and theory and accumulated detail, there is one question that The Simpsons has never answered, and that it never will answer. Is Homer Simpson happy? Not in the moment. Homer is often happy in the moment. His capacity for immediate sensory pleasure, his ability to be fully present in a donut or a beer or a Sunday afternoon of unscheduled television is one of the show's most carefully maintained characteristics and one of his most genuinely human qualities. He experiences joy. The show depicts this joy with affection and with precision. Homer's happiness in its small, immediate forms is real. But in the aggregate, across the full span of his life as the show depicts it, is the life of Homer Simpson, with everything it contains, everything it costs, and everything it provides, a happy life? The show doesn't answer this. It provides the material from which you could construct an argument either way. The job that he hates but that provides for his family. The family that frustrates and disappoints him constantly, and that is also, clearly and permanently, the most important thing in his life. The cognitive damage that prevents him from fully perceiving his own situation and that simultaneously protects him from the full weight of that situation's implications. The mother who left when he was 6 and whose absence shaped everything he became. The moments of genuine joy and genuine connection and genuine grace that occur across his life in the spaces between the catastrophes. Is that a happy life? Is it a life that someone would choose if they could see it clearly? The show suggests that the question may be the wrong one. Not because the answer is obviously yes or obviously no, but because the premise that there is a version of Homer's life visible clearly enough to evaluate is not available. Homer cannot see his own life clearly. We cannot see it fully either, because we see it through the specific distortions of the show's storytelling, which is itself a product of the distortions of Homer's dreaming mind, or of the radiation's cognitive effects, or of whatever has produced the impossible eternal present of Springfield. What the show offers instead of an answer is something more valuable. It offers the texture of the life, the specific quality of what it feels like from the inside, without the verdict. It lets you inhabit the experience rather than evaluate it. And inhabiting it, even briefly, even through the imperfect medium of animation and comedy, produces a kind of understanding that verdict cannot provide. That's what fiction does at its best. Not tell you what to think, but let you feel what it's like to be someone else. To inhabit a life different from your own and come away with some small increment of recognition, some tiny expansion of what you understand as possible human experience. Homer Simpson, in all his impossible complexity, has expanded the understanding of millions of people who have spent time with him. Not because he represents anything clean or admirable or worth emulating, but because he is recognizably human in his needs and his failures and his love and his confusion about his own existence. He doesn't know if he's happy either, but he keeps going. He comes home every night, he sits on the couch, he watches television with his family, and in the morning he gets up and does it again. That might be enough. It might be all any of us can offer. The persistence, the coming back, the choice to stay, made again and again, in conditions that don't always make staying easy. That's the answer the show doesn't give because it doesn't need to. The answer is in the life. The life is on the screen, and the screen is in your home, which makes it, in some small way, part of your life too. The iceberg is still there, and so is Springfield. Number the Lisa and Bart dynamic. A relationship the show built and never finished. The relationship between Lisa and Bart Simpson is one of the most complex sibling dynamics in the history of American television, and it is complex in ways that the show has developed with unusual patience and consistency across 36 seasons, even as other aspects of the show's characterization have drifted or simplified. At first glance, the relationship is organized around contrast. Bart is the underachiever, the rebel, the boy who resists every institutional expectation placed on him and finds meaning in the resistance itself. Lisa is the overachiever, the idealist, the girl who embraces every institutional expectation and is consistently punished by the institution for doing so, because the institution was never designed for someone like her. They are, on the surface, mirror images of each other placed in the same household and forced to navigate a shared reality that neither of them fully fits. But the surface is not the depth, and the depth of this relationship is where the show has done some of its most sustained and honest work. What the surface contrast obscures is that Bart and Lisa are mirror images not just in their relationship to institutions, but in their relationship to a more fundamental problem, which is that they are both profoundly isolated by their natures, both people who do not fully belong in the environment that formed them, and both people who are aware, at some level, of this isolation without fully understanding its dimensions or its causes. Bart's isolation is social. He is genuinely funny, genuinely clever, genuinely perceptive about the social dynamics of his environment. He sees Springfield clearly in ways that most of its residents cannot. But his intelligence operates entirely in the service of immediate social navigation rather than any larger project, and the Springfield environment rewards this specific kind of intelligence while punishing the kind that Lisa has, which is larger, more abstract, more oriented toward questions that Springfield doesn't want asked. Bart's problem is that his gifts are exactly calibrated for the environment that's damaging him. He's good at being in Springfield. He's good at navigating its social currents and exploiting its inconsistencies and making himself a figure of attention and consequence within it. And being good at Springfield means remaining in Springfield, means accepting its terms, means foreclosing the possibilities that his intelligence, in a different context, might have opened. Lisa's problem is the inverse. Her gifts are entirely miscalibrated for the environment she's in. She is not good at being in Springfield. She's good at things Springfield doesn't value, at the kind of thinking that exceeds what Springfield can use, at the kind of feeling that Springfield's emotional range doesn't accommodate. Her intelligence is a constant source of friction with her environment rather than a tool for navigating it. And the friction is exhausting. Episode after episode, the same resistance, the same dismissal, the same experience of being the person in the room who sees something no one else can see and who cannot make anyone else see it. What connects them, underneath all of this, is the specific experience of being a child in a family that is doing its inadequate best with conditions that exceed its capacity. Homer loves them both. Marge loves them both. The love is real and it is insufficient, as parental love often is, not because it fails in intent, but because intent doesn't fully determine outcome, and the outcome for both of these children is a kind of loneliness that the family cannot fully reach. The episodes that are most honest about the Bart and Lisa relationship are the ones that bring them into direct contact with each other's loneliness. The Season 2 episode where Bart realizes that Lisa has no friends and organizes her birthday party specifically to fix this, at significant social cost to himself, is the episode that established the template for what their relationship can be at its best. Bart sees Lisa's isolation clearly. He understands, because he is genuinely perceptive, what it costs her, and he chooses to help her, not because it benefits him in any way, but because she is his sister and her suffering is real to him in a way that Springfield's social currencies are not. The show returns to this structure periodically across its run. Moments where the contrast between the two characters is suspended and the underlying connection is made visible. Moments where what they share, the specific experience of being these particular children in this particular family in this particular impossible town, is more present than what distinguishes them. These moments are the show's most honest statement about what siblings actually are to each other. Not just people who happen to share a household and a set of parents, but people who share a specific world, a specific experience of growing up in a particular place at a particular time with a particular family, and who are therefore connected in ways that exceed friendship and exceed most other forms of human relationship, because the connection is based not on choice or on compatible values or on shared interests, but on the irreducible fact of having been there together. Bart and Lisa were there together, in the impossible, contaminated, eternally resetting world of Springfield, with the plant on the horizon and the three-eyed fish in the river, and the billionaire who owns their father and the mother who maintains the whole fragile structure through an effort of will that the show acknowledges more honestly. In its later seasons, they were there together, and they are there together still. The show has imagined them as adults, in flash-forward episodes that show Lisa as a successful woman and Bart as someone who has found a version of himself that the Springfield years didn't fully foreclose. These imagined futures are affecting in the way that all glimpses of what children might become are affecting, because they make the present tense of childhood visible as temporary, as a stage that will pass, as a moment that the people living through it cannot fully value because they are too close to it to see it whole. Lisa at 8 and Bart at 10 are not the definitive versions of themselves. They are early drafts. Springfield is a particularly difficult environment for the drafts to develop in, but the drafts are there, and the relationship between them is there. And across 36 years of impossible present tense, it has remained one of the show's most consistently human things. They will always be 10 and 8 in Springfield. But in the flash-forwards, in the imagined futures, in the emotional logic that the show has constructed around them, they grow up. They survive Springfield. They become people. That survival, even imagined, even temporary, even wrapped in the caveats of an impossible floating timeline, is one of the show's most genuine gestures of hope. Number. The recurring villains of Springfield. A complete portrait. Mr. Burns is the show's central antagonist, its axis of evil, its organizing principle of institutional malice. But Springfield has produced a rich ecosystem of secondary antagonists across 36 seasons, figures who are lesser in scope and resource than Burns, but who are, in their specific domains, equally revelatory about what the show understands as the mechanisms of harm in American social life. Sideshow Bob is the most formally developed of these secondary antagonists, and his development across the show's run constitutes one of its most extended and unusual creative projects. Bob began as a literal sidekick, the elaborate and theatrical second to Krusty the Clown, a man whose evident intelligence and education made him genuinely incongruous in the context of a low-budget local children's television program. His first appearance as an antagonist, in which he frames Krusty for armed robbery in order to take over the show, establishes the template for his character with remarkable efficiency. He is brilliant. He is theatrical. He is driven by a specific kind of contempt for the vulgar, the undiscriminating, the aesthetically indifferent, that is the intellectual's most identifiable vice. And he is capable of genuine evil in the service of this contempt. His subsequent appearances have elaborated this template into something more complex and, in its best episodes, more genuinely interesting. The tension between Bob's stated cultural values, his love of opera, his classical education, his evident capacity for feeling and aesthetic response, and his actual behavior, his repeated attempts to murder a 10-year-old child for humiliating him, is the show's most sustained exploration of the gap between cultural sophistication and moral development. Bob's argument, implicit across his many episodes, is that his intelligence and cultivation entitle him to something that Springfield's vulgarity has denied him. His grievance is real, in the specific sense that Springfield is genuinely and consistently hostile to the kind of mind he has. The show is honest about this. Springfield is not a good environment for intelligence of Bob's particular kind. The town's resistance to cultivation, its comfort with the mediocre and the cheap, and the immediately gratifying, its indifference to the kind of beauty and difficulty that Bob values, is a real feature of the environment, and Bob's experience of it as hostile is not entirely delusional. But the show is equally honest about the failure that his response to this hostility represents. The contempt he has developed for the people who don't share his values, the specific elevation of his own judgment over the lives of others, the willingness to commit violence in service of his wounded pride, these are not the products of intelligence or cultivation. They are the products of a specific kind of moral failure that intelligence makes possible but does not excuse. Bob is, in this reading, a cautionary figure about what cultural sophistication without moral development produces. He has everything that might be expected to make a person good: education, aesthetic sensitivity, a capacity for feeling that Homer entirely lacks, and he uses it to try to kill a child. The intelligence and the feeling are real. The goodness that they might have produced never developed. Sideshow Bob, across his many appearances, has become progressively more self-aware about this failure, which is what makes his later episodes more interesting than his earlier ones. He knows what he is. He knows the gap between what he tells himself and what he does. And he continues doing it anyway, because the alternative, genuine change, genuine moral development, genuine acceptance of the fact that Bart Simpson does not deserve to die for the crime of humiliating him, would require a kind of surrender that his self-regard cannot accommodate. He is, in this sense, a darker version of the same trap that Springfield has built for all of its residents: the inability to change, the capacity to see what change would require, the unwillingness to pay what change would cost. Principal Skinner, or Armin Tamzarian as he is actually named, is the show's most sustained exploration of institutional authority as performance. Skinner has spent decades performing a version of himself that is not himself, inhabiting an identity stolen from a man he felt he failed, maintaining the performance with the specific, exhausting vigilance of someone who knows that any relaxation of the mask will reveal the nothing underneath it. The show has used Skinner across its run to examine the specific psychological dynamics of institutional authority, the way authority is performed rather than possessed, the way the performance becomes self-sustaining once it has been accepted by the institution, and the way the people who see through the performance are more threatening to the institution than any external challenge. Bart's ongoing war with Skinner is, at this level, a war between the boy who sees the performance for what it is and the man whose survival depends on the performance not being seen. Krusty the Clown is the show's most direct examination of the commodification of childhood, of the specific harm done when entertainment aimed at children is produced entirely from within the logic of commercial calculation by people who have no genuine connection to or feeling for the audience they're addressing. Krusty is not evil in the Burns sense. He is something more banal and in some ways more damaging. He is completely indifferent. He does not dislike children. He doesn't like them either. They are the audience. The audience is the revenue. The revenue is what matters. This indifference is the show's diagnosis of a specific cultural phenomenon: the way commercial children's entertainment produces celebrities who perform the appearance of care and warmth while being entirely motivated by the commercial calculation that the appearance of care and warmth generates. Krusty is not a hypocrite in the conventional sense, because hypocrisy requires the private betrayal of a genuine public commitment. Krusty has no private commitment to betray. He is all surface. The clown makeup is not concealing a different person underneath. It is the person all the way down because there is nothing underneath it. Fat Tony and the Springfield Mob represent the show's examination of the organized crime ecosystem that operates beneath Springfield's surface reality. The mob's relationship with the town's institutions, with the police who accommodate it, with the businesses that pay it, with the political apparatus that is sufficiently corrupt to be useful to it, is a version of the same systemic analysis that the Burns sections provide. Power in Springfield operates through systems. The mob is one of those systems, smaller and less comprehensive than Burns's empire, but organized around the same fundamental principle that the official version of how institutions work is not the actual version, and that the gap between the official and the actual is where power lives. Number. The legacy of Springfield. What 36 years of a cartoon tells us about storytelling? When The Simpsons premiered in December of 1989, the idea that it would still be running in 2025 would have seemed not just unlikely, but essentially impossible. Long-running television was a phenomenon reserved for game shows and soap operas, forms of programming that were understood to be endlessly renewable because they were organized around formats rather than stories. Narrative television, television that was fundamentally character-driven, had a natural lifespan governed by the stories it could tell and the audience's appetite for those stories. Eventually, the stories ran out, or the audience moved on, or both. The Simpsons has never run out of stories. Not because it has found an infinite supply of genuinely new stories to tell. The later seasons have recycled more plot structures than fans are entirely comfortable acknowledging. It has never run out of stories because the character relationships at its center are inexhaustible in the specific sense that the most important human relationships are inexhaustible. There is always something more to discover about what it means to be in a family. There is always another angle from which the specific combination of love and frustration and history and obligation and choice that constitutes a family can be examined. This inexhaustibility is not unique to The Simpsons. Every major work of literary fiction that has endured for centuries has endured for the same reason. The characters and relationships at the center of the work are rich enough to reward continuous re-examination, to reveal new things on each return, to remain interesting across the radical changes in context that accompany decades or centuries of cultural change. What is unusual about The Simpsons is that it has achieved this kind of inexhaustibility in the specific medium of American primetime animated comedy, a medium that before the show's premiere was not understood to be capable of the kind of sustained, serious character work that produces enduring cultural objects. The show changed what animation was understood to be able to do. It demonstrated that the freedom from realistic visual constraint that animation provides is compatible with, and can even enhance, genuinely complex human storytelling. This demonstration has had consequences for every animated television series that has followed it. The Simpsons didn't just influence its successors in the obvious ways, in its humor style and its social satire and its willingness to address adult concerns in an animated format. It demonstrated at the level of medium that animation could hold serious human content without it becoming incongruous, that the cartoon format was not a limitation on emotional depth, but a different set of possibilities for achieving it. The legacy of the show is measured in the shows that it made possible. Family Guy, which emerged directly from The Simpsons' commercial and cultural success. Futurama, which Groening developed as a companion piece. South Park, which absorbed the show's satirical ambition and pushed it toward more extreme territory. Bob's Burgers, which returned to the warm, family-centered approach of the show's early seasons. And beyond animation, the general expansion of what American television was willing to attempt in terms of serialized character drama, an expansion that happened in the context of a culture that had been educated, partly by The Simpsons, to expect more from the medium. The iceberg of The Simpsons, the full depth of what the show has accumulated across 36 seasons, is also a record of what long-form storytelling can do when it is given enough time and enough sustained creative attention. The patterns that emerge from that duration, the theories that become possible only when there is enough material for patterns to be visible, the emotional depth that accumulates across hundreds of hours of engagement with the same characters in the same place. These are the specific products of duration that no single work of finite length can produce. The Simpsons is an argument, made in 36 seasons of animated comedy, for the value of staying with something, of returning, episode after episode, season after season, year after year, to the same place and the same people and the same questions, of trusting that sustained engagement with a fictional world, even one that is clearly impossible and clearly flawed and clearly inconsistent, produces something that is not available from the single brilliant experience, the perfect season, the complete and contained work of narrative art. What it produces is something like home, the specific quality of a place you know well enough to love its imperfections, to find comfort in its familiarity even when the familiarity occasionally exhausts you, to feel, when you return to it, something that resembles what you feel when you return to an actual home after an absence. Springfield is home for millions of people who have never been there and never could be. The couch is where they grew up. The opening credits are a memory that predates most of their other television memories. Homer's voice is, for people of a certain age, one of the most recognizable sounds in their experiential archive. This is what 36 years of a cartoon does to a culture. It becomes part of the culture's experience of itself. It becomes a reference point, a shared vocabulary, a common ground that people can find across the considerable differences of background and geography and perspective that separate them in other contexts. Springfield is not just a town. It's a place where Americans have been meeting each other in the shared space of the television set for longer than most living Americans can fully account for in their own memories. That's the legacy, not the Emmy Awards, not the cultural moment, not the individual brilliant episodes that the fan community returns to again and again as evidence of what the show can do at its absolute best. The legacy is Springfield, the place that doesn't exist and that everyone knows, the family that is impossible and that everyone recognizes, the story that never ends and that, for millions of people, is part of how they understand what a story is. We are all from Springfield. We just had to spend 36 years getting there. Number, the final descent. What lies at the very bottom? The iceberg has many levels. We have been descending through them for the duration of this video, moving from the surface information, the production history and the character backgrounds and the famous episodes, through the middle depths of the fan theories and the production controversies and the architectural mysteries, and down into the darker and stranger territory where the theories converge and the show's deepest preoccupations become visible. But at the very bottom, below all of the theory and all of the analysis and all of the accumulated mythology, there is something simpler than any of it. There is a yellow family on a yellow couch in a house at 742 Evergreen Terrace in a town called Springfield. The father is large and loving and damaged. The mother is patient and strong and quietly remarkable. The son is funny and sharp and terrified of becoming nothing. The daughter is brilliant and lonely and committed to a vision of the world that Springfield refuses to share. And the baby watches everything, from behind a pacifier, with eyes that see more than any of them know. They are together. At the end of every episode, through every catastrophe and every reset and every impossible thing the town has done and had done to it, they are together on that couch. The family survives. The house stands. The television plays. This is the bottom of the iceberg. This is what everything else, all the radiation and the coma dreams and the conspiracy and the unsolved mystery and the floating timeline and the billionaire who won't die, is organized around. This simple, impossible, indestructible fact. The family is together. And when the credits roll and the screen goes dark and the episode ends and you're back in your own home, in your own silence, in whatever time of night or morning you've been watching from, you carry that with you. The family persists. The story continues. Springfield is still there. And tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever you need it, you can go back. You can always go back to Springfield. That's what the iceberg is, at the very bottom. Not the darkness, not the contamination, or the theories, or the impossibility of it all. It's the family. Still there. Still together. Still on the couch. Still home. Number the characters Springfield forgot. A complete accounting. Every long-running show accumulates a category of character that the production history calls a development casualty, and that the audience tends to notice only in retrospect. When someone points out that a figure who was once a regular presence in Springfield simply stopped appearing without explanation, The Simpsons, across 36 seasons, has produced a significant number of these figures, and examining them collectively reveals something about what the show has understood, across different periods of its production, as essential, and what it has understood as expendable. Mindy Simmons appeared in a Season 5 episode as a female co-worker at the power plant who shared Homer's precise combination of interests and appetites. The episode built toward the suggestion that Homer and Mindy represented a kind of perfect match, two people aligned in their desires and their personalities in a way that Homer and Marge, for all their love, are not. The episode ultimately resolved in favor of the marriage. But the character of Mindy, and the question she raised about what Homer is and what Marge represents to him, was dropped entirely. She appeared once and was never referenced again. The decision to drop her was a production decision, made for reasons of story, economy, and comfort with the show's central domestic configuration. But the character's disappearance left something unresolved. The question she raised, about whether Homer's commitment to Marge is a function of deep love or of the specific cognitive limitations that make him unable to fully perceive or act on alternatives, was a real question. The show raised it and then retreated from it. Lurleen Lumpkin, the country singer who appeared in a Season 3 episode and who fell genuinely in love with Homer, represents a similar case. Her episode is one of the show's most honest examinations of Homer's capacity to inspire genuine feeling in other people, even in people who fully perceive his limitations, because there is something in him, some quality of uncomplicated warmth and genuine appreciation that is genuinely attractive to people who have been surrounded by calculated attention. Lurleen saw Homer clearly and loved him anyway. The episode resolved in favor of the marriage. Lurleen disappeared. These disappeared characters are not simply casualties of episodic storytelling's natural limitations. They are, collectively, evidence of the show's sustained negotiation with the question of what its central characters are capable of and what possibilities it is willing to leave genuinely open. The show raises questions and resolves them conservatively, returning always to the baseline configuration. The characters who represented alternatives to that configuration are removed from the field, and Springfield's social landscape is correspondingly less complex in their absence. This pattern of character introduction and disappearance is one of the mechanisms through which Springfield maintains its impossible stability. New people arrive. They challenge the established configuration. The established configuration reasserts itself. The new people leave, and Springfield continues, as it always has, organized around the same central relationships, the same family, the same neighborhood, the same diner and bar and power plant and elementary school and church. The show's world is not static because it is lazy. It is static because the forces that maintain its stability are active and effective, and the characters who challenge that stability are not merely forgotten. They are defeated. Their defeat is the mechanism of the reset. Their absence is the evidence of Springfield's defensive immune response to the new. This immune response has been working for 36 years. The town has fought off every challenge to its configuration. Every character who arrived with the potential to change something has been accommodated and neutralized and eventually removed from the narrative. The family remains, the town remains, the impossible eternal present remains. And somewhere in the background of an episode you watched years ago, if you look carefully, you can see the evidence of everyone who tried to change it and didn't. Number. A final word on why any of this matters. The question that underlies the entire enterprise of Simpsons fan theory, the question that motivates the extraordinary effort that fans have invested in the show's mythology and production history and character analysis across decades of active engagement, is not really about The Simpsons. It is the question that attaches to any cultural object that has been sufficiently present and sufficiently complex to merit the investment. Why does this matter? What is it about this particular show, this particular family, this particular impossible town that makes it worth spending hours in analysis and theory and discussion? What does the time and the effort and the genuine intellectual engagement actually produce that makes it worthwhile? The answer is not about the show. The answer is about what happens when you engage deeply with something. When you stop accepting the surface and start following the evidence wherever it leads. When you treat a work of popular culture as though it deserves the same quality of attention that you would give to something that the cultural hierarchy has already designated as important. The Simpsons has been designated as important by the cultural hierarchy. It has won more Emmy Awards than any other comedy series. It has been the subject of academic analysis, of serious journalism, of the kind of cultural commentary that constitutes official recognition of importance. So engaging with it seriously is, in some sense, already endorsed. But the fan engagement, the theories and the episode analysis and the production history research and the close reading of specific scenes for implications that the show did not explicitly authorize, this is something different from the official recognition. This is the audience doing what audiences have always done with cultural objects that matter to them, which is to take them more seriously than the objects took themselves, to find in them more than was consciously put there, to make meaning from the material that the material's creators could not have anticipated. This is what human beings do with things that matter. We find in them what we need to find. We bring our own experience and our own questions and our own grief and our own hope to the material, and we encounter, in the collision between ourselves and the material, something that neither we nor the material could have produced alone. The iceberg is that collision. It is everything that happens when you take The Simpsons seriously enough to follow it all the way down. What you find at the bottom is not the show. What you find is yourself, reflected back through the specific medium of a family in a yellow house in a town that doesn't exist. And that reflection, strange and distorted and impossible as it is one of the things that tells you who you are and where you come from and what you carry with you from the years you spent watching. That's what the iceberg gives you. That's what it has always given. Not answers. Reflections. And the reflection goes all the way down. Number. The show that outlasted everything. There is a specific quality that belongs only to things that have lasted long enough to outlive the conditions that produce them. The Simpsons was created in a specific cultural moment, in a specific economic environment, by a specific group of people with specific ideas about what American family life looked like and what television could do with it. That moment is gone. The conditions that produced the show no longer exist. The writers who created its foundational mythology have largely moved on. The cultural landscape the show was commenting on has transformed so completely that the original targets of its satire are historical artifacts rather than living phenomena. And the show is still running. This is extraordinary in a way that is easy to miss, because the show's continued presence feels normal, has felt normal for so long that its normality is itself remarkable. Most things end. Most television shows end. Most cultural phenomena exhaust themselves and are replaced by new ones, and the replaced things become nostalgic objects, fondly or bitterly remembered, but no longer active participants in the ongoing cultural conversation. The Simpsons has not become a nostalgic object. It has remained a participant, still producing new episodes, still generating new moments and new references and new instances of the ongoing conversation that 36 years of its presence has made possible. How? By what mechanism has a television show survived everything that would ordinarily end a television show? The quality question, the perpetual debate about whether the later seasons are good enough to justify the show's continuation, is real, but not ultimately decisive. The show has survived quality concerns because quality, in the conventional critical sense, is not what it is primarily offering. What it is offering is continuity. The continuation of something that has been present long enough to become part of the fabric of its audience's lives. The continuation of the family. The continuation of Springfield. People do not watch new Simpsons episodes primarily to be delighted by the comedy, though the comedy is sometimes still very good. They watch because the show is still there, because Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are still on the couch, because the opening credits are still playing and the theme is still the theme and Springfield is still Springfield. They watch because stopping would mean acknowledging that something they have had for their entire lives is over, and no one is ready for that. The show knows this. The show has always known this. From the moment it became clear that it was going to last longer than anyone had expected, that it was going to become something more than a television program and closer to a permanent fixture of American life. The show knows that what it provides, at this point in its history, is not primarily entertainment. It is presence. The specific comfort of ongoing presence, of something you can always return to, of a story that has no end date and no conclusion, and no moment at which you have to say goodbye. The floating timeline is this. The aging problem is this. The reset is this. All of the show's impossibilities are, at this level, the same impossibility. The impossibility of a story that refuses to end. That insists on continuing. That will not release its characters into the future because the future is where stories end and this story is not going to end. Not yet. Not while we keep watching. Not while Springfield is still there. And Springfield is still there. It will be there tomorrow, and next week, and next season. And however many seasons after that the show continues to run. The family will be on the couch, the credits will play, the theme will sound, and somewhere in the world, right now, someone is watching. In the dark, in the quiet, finding their way home to a house on Evergreen Terrace that exists nowhere and belongs to everyone. That's the show. That's the iceberg. That's all of it. From the very top to the deepest bottom. 36 years, nearly 800 episodes. One family, one town, one couch, and all of us watching. Good night.